We're created in the City Center Conference Room. It's 2:01 p.m. on March 20th. And this meeting is being broadcast live on YouTube, Provo City Council, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. Please be aware that the microphones in the room pick up the noise of paper and other rustling objects. Further, be aware that the microphones can pick up side conversations. Let's begin with the roll call.
Cliff Strachan.
George Hanley. Dave Connect.
Elizabeth Anderson.
Gary Winterton.
David Harding.
Dave School. George Stewart. Let's go around the room too.
John Borgett.
Rebecca Andrus.
Jen Hoffman.
Erica Gaddis.
Kym Shelley.
Mark Oldroyd. Dave Pepper. Jimmy McKnight. Shane Jones.
David Torgerson. Corey Christensen.
Justin Graybaugh.
Shelley Turnbull.
Thank you very much. And
Kay Van Buren.
thanks, Jay. Before we begin with where's Bryce here? Let's see Bryce here. Is Bryce on today?
He's here. Is he?
Okay. Well, I need Bryce. We're going to say, I was going to say Bryce can sing happy birthday to John. Bryce can get started, but we can just, John, happy birthday for one.
That's good. Thank you.
That's a good idea. Bryce, so that's okay.
We're good.
But we'll just wish you a happy birthday.
Well, appreciate that.
And we'll begin with an opening prayer by,
Before we go into the song,
would you like to?
Due to time and everything, I appreciate the recognition. We can move on.
We're going to move on without the happy birthday song. We're just going to tell him happy birthday.
happy birthday.
Thanks, Ryan.
Sorry, we're trying to cut our budget if we sang to him.
Oh, no.
Father in heaven, we are grateful to Thee for this opportunity that we have to gather in our roles as servants of the people of Provo and of Utah, and we ask Thee to assist us in our roles. Please help us to be able to work through these complicated issues and direct us to the decisions that will best serve people of Provo and the people of the state of Utah. And we ask Thee to help us communicate clearly and openly, and that we may work collaboratively for the good of the people. And this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Thank you. Just going to make a little change here. Dave Decker wanted a couple minutes maybe to introduce you and to introduce the subject that we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Chair Winterton, for allowing me just to give a brief introduction. And thank you to the council for the chance that we have to spend a pretty significant amount of time on the wastewater treatment plant and a pretty difficult decision that the city is facing in the near future relative to the treatment plant. I also wanted to acknowledge, again, staff that has spent so much time. I can't remember how many presentations now that we've made on the treatment plant, but it's a number of presentations, and thank Gary, our consultants, and all the staff that's attending today. I also wanted to thank Erica Gaddis and her staff for coming today. Erica has been good to work with us. We've had a number of meetings, also conference calls, and shared some information. And one of the things, I'll let Erica introduce the rest of her staff and kind of go through the intent of their attendance today. But we did share some questions. They're getting passed out right now. We shared these questions in advance with the state. So they're not getting blindsided with these questions. These are ones that we have reviewed with the state in a recent conference call. And so the nature of the questions are really to try to help the council understand what we're concerned about, topics that we feel are important to get discussed with the state officials. And clearly, we encourage you to take opportunity to ask follow-up questions. There's a lot of other areas in these questions that probably ought to be asked while we have state officials here. We asked them to take about an hour, and I know with the questions that you may have, that may go longer than that. That's not a hard fixed rule, but we do have a number of other things that we'd like to cover in addition to the state. Jimmy will follow that with some finance information, and then I'll try to wrap up with just a few things. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Erica and her staff.
Can you bring up the presentation that I've prepared? There we go. Well, I am really grateful to be here. Thank you all for taking so much time to really consider what is a very important decision, both for Provo City, for Utah County, and for the state of Utah. I also want to express our appreciation to the public works staff. Since we met with the council in the fall of 2016, we've had numerous meetings with Public Works, and they've also been very good to work with. We're working through some tough issues, some tough questions. I know there's a lot at stake in terms of both costs and benefits with respect to this decision. So again, thank you for giving it such good consideration. We really do consider Provo City to be a leader here in Utah County, and it's very important to the state to help and support this decision-making process. So last time we were here, we talked a bit about the why we are beginning to regulate nutrients in Utah. We talked a lot about Utah Lake and the water quality concerns there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. I'm happy to answer questions if you want to go back to that. But Public Works asked us to focus instead on kind of giving you an idea of the regulations that we have today, the regulatory kind of future, and to discuss some financing options that we can bring to the city as you consider a large capital project. Before I go any further, let me introduce two people that I have with me. Kym Shelley, who's the Assistant Director for the Division of Water Quality. She comes from our permitting side of our shop. So if you ask me any really hard permitting questions, I'm going to defer to Kym. And then Ken Hoffman comes from our engineering section. He's been working on the city's variance request. He's probably the most familiar with the facility or the plan that you've submitted to us. So any questions related to that, wastewater engineering, he can answer. I just wanted to start with kind of our purpose for being here today. The first is to, again, provide you an update on current and future regulations that you might want to consider that may be relevant to this decision that you have in front of you. We want to offer our technical and financial resources to the city to help with this treatment plant planning and decision making, and answer any of your questions. And then I'm happy to answer questions related to the topics I'll discuss today or anything else that is of interest to the council. I'm going to start with the regulatory update and then kind of end with the money stuff. So Provo's current UPDS permit, as you know, Provo currently discharges into Mill Race, which then goes into Provo Bay, part of Utah Lake. Current permit effluent limits are for a number of different parameters, and we want to emphasize that although this is one of the oldest wastewater treatment plants in the state, it has a good compliance history, and the staff have been great to work with, given existing limits. So what we're looking at is sort of upping the game across the Wasatch Front to incorporate nutrient limits into wastewater treatment. So I just want to make that clear. You've heard about this. This is what's driving the decision today. This is the Phosphorus Rule. I want to take a little bit of time sort of explaining the difference between a technology-based limit and a water quality-based limit as we go a little bit further, because any future limits would be from a water quality basis. A technology-based phosphorus, our technology-based limit is a 1 milligram per liter limit by 2020 that every mechanical wastewater treatment plant in the state must meet. This was developed with extensive stakeholder input. It was actually an idea that was proposed by the municipal wastewater community as a way for us to make progress in nutrient reductions without excessive regulations. And I could talk about the history of that. EPA came out with some pretty stringent regulations in 2002 and 2004. The state of Utah did not adopt those, and instead we've developed our own nutrient program. This is the first one of 3 main elements of that nutrient program. We came to this council in March of 2011. We came back in September 2016, and it was a good reminder for us that many of the council people that had been here in 2011 were no longer here in 2016. So that's been a good lesson for us that we need to get out and meet with councils and boards more frequently. We modified our rule twice, really to accommodate some variance options, and Provo City is taking advantage of 2 of those options that we'll talk about a little bit today. Those variances are really made as a result of economic hardship. If you have an innovative alternative to achieve a commensurate phosphorus reduction, or if you're working on a large capital project and you're have a due diligence towards the construction of that project. Just as a reminder of where we're headed, often people ask me, well, how do we know we need to reduce nutrients to Utah Lake? And I think what this graphic shows is how do we know that tripling the nutrient loads to Utah Lake in the next 30 years is going to be acceptable? We already have nutrient concerns and problems in the lake. Left unchecked, the loads coming out of the phosphorus treatment, or out of the Provo treatment plant, would escalate with growth. I mean, as you have more people, you have more wastewater, and therefore you have more loading to the lake. That's true across Utah County, and that's one of the reasons that Utah Lake, sorting this out now, is such a high priority for the state, because it is such a large area of growth. So the green bars are where the loading would be with the Phosphorus Rule, and the red bars are where they would be without. So you can see by 2050, we'll kind of be back to where we were in 2000. So we're buying ourselves time, is the way we think of this rule, especially here. One of the questions on the list was the status of Provo's variance request. It should be posted momentarily. We were hoping to have it posted on our website. By the time I got here today, it's with our web team. We have issued for public comment a draft approval of the due diligence variance request. It'll go out for 30-day public notice today. It has 4 milestones incorporated that were negotiated with Public Works. The first is that by June of this year, we really need to see this council making a decision in terms of direction. So you have in front of you kind of 3 big options: upgrading your current facility, doing a phased new facility, or a brand new wastewater treatment plant. So by June, we'd like to know the direction of that. And the reason we need that milestone is in the event that the city decides not to do a big capital project, then this due diligence variance request will be retracted, and we'll expect the city to meet the limit with chemical treatment by 2020. So we want to leave enough time for that possibility, although we have full confidence that the city is on a good track to do a big project. By December of 2019, we would expect the city to submit a complete capital facilities plan. By May of 2019, or is that supposed to be 2018, Ken? 2019. May of 2019, a city council resolution that selects the specific technology. So right now you're kind of talking about big picture options. You'll need to make a decision about a particular technology next year. And then by January 1st of 2022, a complete construction permit application. And then the variance was granted all the way through 2025. So you get an additional 5 years for your compliance date. In the interim, everyone that's getting a variance is getting an interim phosphorus effluent limit for their existing facility, and we've agreed on a 3.5 milligram per liter effluent limit in the interim for the current facility. Provo also submitted an innovative alternative for commensurate phosphorus reduction request. It was sort of a placeholder variance request without not a lot of specifics. So depending on the direction you go, there may be a need for an innovative alternative, and I'll talk about some of those that have been discussed and kind of our opinion on some of them. But we will reply to that variance request once we have more specifics, should it be needed. So the city asked me to talk a little bit about future regulations. This is a really uncomfortable topic for us to try and predict what will happen in the future. But I also understand it's really difficult for cities to make decisions with all of this regulatory uncertainty. So I'm going to talk about a couple things that we know are on the horizon and give you an idea of where they might go. Please don't take this to mean that this is an action for sure. We have a lot of work to do on a number of these different topics, but really, I guess the message should be we encourage you to select a project and a technology that can accommodate future regulations, and I think your design team has several of those in mind. So the first would be ammonia. In 2013, EPA adopted new ammonia criteria to protect aquatic life. Utah is one of the only states in the country that has not just adopted those straight into rule. They are much more stringent than current ammonia limits, and they're really based on the sensitivity of particular aquatic life mollusks. And we have some concerns that perhaps some of those species are not present in Utah, and so we don't want to overregulate unless it's necessary. So we've decided to delay adoption of these until we've done additional research. We've hired Utah State University to do that research. We're further through the first step, which is a partnership with the state of Colorado to look for the presence of these particular species. I'm not going to go into all the details there in the Intermountain West. And then based on that, we'll be focusing on receiving waters and really trying to figure out if these are the right regulations for our wastewater receiving waters, and if not, what the alternative regulations should be. All of that should be sorted out by 2021, but will likely be looked at on a site-specific basis. And by site-specific, I mean water body-specific basis. Just to give you a sense of the impact that this regulation could have had if we had adopted it straight out, you can see that the blue here is the existing limit, ammonia limit for Provo City's discharge. This is the chronic ammonia limit. If we had adopted EPA 2013 regulations, we would have, cut it by about half, which has a pretty big impact.
Curious, so that's where it would have been, and or what the limit is now, but do we know where we're operating at?
Less than one.
Less than one, okay. Thank you.
Anyway, ammonia is one, as you're designing your new facility, to be mindful of. And this is just a quick map showing some of the initial studies do show that the species of concern, or at least the family of the mollusks of concern, are found in Utah Lake and in some of the receiving waters. There's a lot of other questions about whether early life stages are present, the seasonality of ammonia, I won't get into, but ammonia is certainly something that should be considered as you're thinking about this decision. Another that's sort of further out on the horizon are pharmaceuticals and personal care products. This is a topic that's of great public interest around the country. EPA did fund a project. So these are things like everything from what's in your shampoos to household products that go down the drain and maybe move through wastewater treatment plants. EPA funded a project, a national project, and found 52 out of 111 personal care products or pharmaceuticals in Utah's waters. So it is a problem. Probably the best study in Utah has been done up on East Canyon Creek. The Snyderville Basin Water Reclamation District has been looking at the effects of their effluent on fish because it's an effluent dominated stream. They actually make up most of the water in East Canyon Creek in the summertime.
Well, that state's prescription over-the-counter drugs. I mean, people take them and then go to the bathroom.
Yep.
It's not they're putting them in directly.
Sometimes they are down the toilet,
Some,
people, but mostly, I mean, a lot of the drugs, prescription and non-prescription that we take go straight through us. Yeah. And some treatment plants are able to take out some of those and some are not. It's not something that treatment plants have historically been designed to do. So we don't have any current plans to regulate these, but it is something that's out there on the horizon. It is a public perception issue, and as water levels decline and the amount of wastewater in our streams increases, the relative importance of these sorts of emerging concerns becomes more and more real. So just something to be aware of. Yes?
Even though it's not going to be required, would it be good to have the ability?
Great. It would be great. We'd love to see it. And Snyderville Basin has been looking into that and exploring different treatment options and the way that they run their facility for that particular reason. They've found, be careful without having their results right in front of me, but they have found effects on the fish populations in East Canyon Creek. Other things just to have, to be mindful of, as you consider a change in your discharge location, all of the permit limits could change. So we base our permit limits on the standards in the water body that you're discharging to, and that largely and then the dilution that's associated with it, in addition to the effluent from your wastewater treatment plant. So I know there's been discussion about moving the discharge point from mill race to an open lake discharge. That will change the permit limits, and we can help with that, looking at kind of scenarios. We've offered to do that. I can't tell you whether they'll go up or down. Mill race doesn't have a lot of dilution, I can tell you that. So without over speaking, I think it's fair to assume that, you know, you might, for some of the other parameters, might see a little bit of relief. Metals, we look at metal effluent limits every 5 years. We use what we call a reasonable potential analysis. So we look at the metal concentrations in the effluent, and we compare them, the relative concentration, to the standard. And if you trip a certain level, then we start to look at monitoring requirements and even regulating metals concentrations. That's starting to happen on the Jordan River. A number of the facilities on the Jordan River are now having to both monitor and treat for metals. And then of course, phosphorus and nitrogen, and I'll talk a bit more about that. That's really the driver here, and has kind of brought us to this point. So currently the phosphorus effluent limit is a technology-based limit. That's a concentration, the 1 milligram per liter. It's based on what we believe is a reasonable, modest target with conventional treatment technology. Any future nutrient regulations will be driven by the water quality needs of Utah Lake and the tributaries to Utah Lake. And so they won't be a flat number that's the same for everyone in the state. They will be specific to that water body and its needs. So I want to talk about the Utah Lake Water Quality Study a bit, just to help you understand where we're going with that and how this study will could result in additional nutrient regulations for the city. So you've seen this slide before. We presented it in 2016. I'm happy to announce that our steering committee is seated and has met multiple times. We're in the process and very close to seating a science panel to guide the Utah Lake Water Quality Study. The primary purpose of the study will be to evaluate the role of excess nutrients on the uses of Utah Lake. That's recreational uses, aquatic life uses, and agricultural uses. And the primary purpose will be to identify in-lake nutrient endpoints or water quality standards. So what do the nutrient levels need to be in the lake? Now, that is not equivalent to what they need to be in your effluent. So just make sure that, I think there's been some confusion about that in the past. Right now, you're discharging at 3.5 milligrams per liter, or 3, I don't know where you guys are exactly, but 2 to 3 to 4 milligrams per liter. And the concentration of phosphorus in the water column of Utah Lake is on the order of 0.05 to 0.1, so order of magnitude lower. And that's because the lake does have some capacity to assimilate some nutrients. And so all of that will be factored in how we would translate any in-lake nutrient to any new permit limit. The reason that we're doing this study, I think we've talked about the recent harmful algal blooms, trying to provide a little bit more regulatory certainty to the state, to the city, and a continuation of efforts that we really started in 2004. We have a $1 million grant from our Water Quality Board to conduct this study, and during the legislative session this year, the Utah Lake Commission got $500,000 to add to our $1 million. So we think we'll be able to do a really robust study and do some good science to inform any future regulations. The process that we're working with here is a steering committee that is co-chaired by myself and Eric Ellis from the Utah Lake Commission. Any recommendations will come from a science panel that we're going to be seating here in the next couple of weeks. Studies will be done, contracted to most likely universities around the state to come and answer some of our scientific questions. Then all that gets packaged up into a recommendation that will go to the Utah Lake Commission for endorsement, and then ultimately to our Water Quality Board for approval. Any standard, any new water quality standard has to be approved by EPA before we can incorporate it into a permit. So there is that EPA step as well. We're pretty good at developing packages that are approvable by EPA, so that's really where our expertise comes in. This is a big graph, but I just wanted to point out that Gary Calder from Provo City is sitting on the steering committee as a municipal rep. There are 3 municipal representatives in addition to a POTW representative, Timpanogos Special Service District. So that's been a good collaborative effort, and it's going slower than we had hoped, but we're making good progress. I won't go through all of this in detail. You've seen it before, but we're going to be studying kind of all angles of the nutrient question. What are the dynamics? Where are the nutrients coming from? What's the relative importance of wastewater versus stormwater versus agriculture? How important is the recreational use? How do people feel about algae, both in terms of aesthetics and in terms of health? And then what are the costs and benefits of nutrient reductions further to Utah Lake? So in terms of how all of that study will get rolled into any new regulations, I think it's important for you to just have some understanding of our process. So under the Clean Water Act, Utah Lake's beneficial uses were designated in the 1970s. And I already said recreation, aquatic life, and agricultural uses. What we're intending to do here is set a new water quality standard for Utah Lake. So that will be a in-lake phosphorus and nitrogen number. It may be seasonal. It may be different for different seasons. And then based on that standard, if the lake is exceeding that, and that's called our assessment, then we would call the lake impaired. It's already listed as impaired because of the algae, but from a nutrient perspective, that new standard would be what we use as the benchmark to determine if the lake's impaired. If it is impaired, and we think it's probable that it would be, but we may find that the science may show that the nutrient concentrations in Utah Lake are acceptable and that we can delist it. So there's that possibility. If it is impaired, we would go into what's called a TMDL study, where we look at all of the sources of nutrients to the lake, not just wastewater, and we allocate loads to everybody. So as an example, there would be points. These are just a made up example, so don't read anything into these numbers. There would be waste load allocations that would get incorporated into permits for wastewater and stormwater, any CAFOs discharging, any industrial discharges. Those are the regulated sources. The non-point sources are things like agricultural runoff, natural sources, forest management, and those we address through our voluntary non-point source program. We have incentive-based mechanisms to get people to make improvements in that area. I think it's really important to also point out that we account for future growth when we allocate those loads. And so, as the city grows, you would likely get a load allocation both for your current flow and for your future projected flow. So we would build that into the analysis. And then we build in a margin of safety because of the uncertainty associated with the analysis. So we expect if we need to go to a TMDL that would likely happen by 2023. And the steering committee has effectively said they want to stay on through that entire process. They don't want to stop at the standards. They want to look at sources. They want to look at costs. They want to look at implementation. And so if they're willing, we're willing to make that commitment. Any new permit limits that would come from this process would not be implemented until 2030. That's a commitment we made to all of the communities around Utah Lake, and we're going to stick with that commitment. There's a couple kind of arrows back and forth here. So obviously after implementation, we hope to see recovery of the lake, and we assess it again, and ideally it's no longer impaired. And then I've got here too, just water quality standards in general inform your permit in addition to the TMDL. So like I said, the Phosphorus Rule is concentration-based. Any new limit would likely be load-based. It would be a certain poundage of phosphorus or nitrogen that's allowed to be discharged into the lake during a given period of time, whether that's a season or annual or monthly, we don't know yet. But it'd be a little bit different kind of permit limit than what you're seeing now. So I'm going to move on to treatment innovation and regulatory flexibility. This is something else that Public Works asked me to talk about, but feel free to stop me if you have questions as we go. This is very wordy. Yes.
I have a question about so the phosphorus levels are also affected by, algae blooms are also affected by climate change. And so if the climate's changing faster than the phosphorus rates are going up, say the phosphorus rates are actually better, they're improved over time, but the climate is warmer, does that make the need for the regulations to be even stiffer to prevent the blooms?
Could be. This would be something we'll ask the science panel to look into. So typically what we do is we we look for a reasonable, not absolute worst case, but a kind of reasonable worst case climate scenario to model and to base the standards off of. And it's difficult for a treatment plant to change every year with high water year, low water year. We've run into some situations where there's no water in the reservoir. It becomes kind of silly to think about what's an appropriate nutrient concentration when there's no water at all. So, you have to get to something that's meaningful. But climate is certainly something we're aware of. It's something that we're paying attention to, and it's something we'll ask the scientists to really factor in. We've got pretty good, actually northern Utah, the climate models that are downscaled from the global models are pretty variable because there's a lot of factors. We're kind of at the boundary of, the Southwest will become a lot hotter and drier, and the Northwest may become wetter. So it's not just, is it going to be hotter, but are we going to get more rain, and how will that affect stormwater, and how will that affect nutrient concentrations, and will temperatures in the lake change as a result? Yeah.
So the department's asking cities to do a whole lot of work to clean up the effluent going in, and yet that's only a small portion of what's going in there because of the farming uses and that. Yep. What steps are being taken to clean up
the other?
Yeah.
Yep. So the other big ones are stormwater, which is also largely municipal, and agriculture. So on the agricultural side, under the Clean Water Act, we can't regulate agricultural runoff. We regulate discharges from confined animal feeding operations, but everything else is on a voluntary basis. So we have a fund, $1 million a year, that we get from a combination of state and federal funds to encourage people to make those improvements. What we have done is moved a watershed, we call them watershed planners, that go about actually going and knocking on people's doors and talking to them about their operations and looking for opportunities to make those improvements. We moved a planner from Cedar City up to Provo last year. And so he's been working mostly in the southern part of the valley to find those kind of low-hanging fruit and opportunities to make those improvements. So we understand that's an important part of it. The mechanism to get those reductions is just a little bit different. On the stormwater side, is a little bit more complicated. Stormwater is regulated, but it's not regulated in the same way that a wastewater treatment plant is regulated. And so for the most part, we look at municipalities, we issue permits to municipalities to manage the stormwater within their boundaries according to certain guidelines. Once we finish a TMDL, it's possible, and in fact probably probable, that municipalities and others would have waste load allocations that they would have to meet in terms of loading to the lake, just like a wastewater treatment plant. And I'll talk a little bit about integrated permitting, but at that point, there is opportunity for, say, Provo City to trade within, look at the cost benefit of stormwater versus wastewater, and even do some trading within your own city. So that the load allocations and TMDLs are negotiated with all of the sources in the basin. Yeah.
I appreciate the answer, and I appreciate the political realities of voluntary and mandatory and whatnot. But it's just interesting that $1 million a year to support those voluntary efforts, it's going to take 60 years for statewide what Provo City is looking at doing in the next 20 years. So
now I should say that's our money. NRCS brings a lot more money every year.
Who's that?
NRCS, Natural Conservation Service. It's the old Soil Conservation Service, federal partner. They bring a lot more funding to agricultural sources. We partner with them a lot to leverage our funding. The last numbers I saw were we get about a 6-to-1 match on our money. So although we only are putting $1 million out, we're seeing $7, sometimes $8 million going on the ground statewide. I fully agree. We need a lot more. In fact, you look at Minnesota, they have a mechanism to fund their non-point source program statewide. They get $100 million a year and they use it all. We get, we have a solicitation every year, and we often have 4 or 5 times the requests than we have funding to give. So it's an important point. And when I talk about some of the innovation, there is an opportunity for the city to trade with, if you wanted to find agricultural projects and work out trading schemes, if that's more cost beneficial to the city, we can entertain that. It's not something that's been done in Utah. It has been done in other states, and it's something that we have the flexibility to do when it comes to nutrients. Yeah. So when we talk about new and innovative technologies and ideas, just a few thoughts. We encourage innovation. We have a relatively young staff that's also very creative and innovative. We're looking at other states and taking ideas, and we're always open to innovation. We review projects with respect to technologies that are used for wastewater treatment on a case-by-case basis based on their engineering merits. So there are no technologies that we say absolutely never, and there are technologies that are much easier for us to review and approve because they're pretty well established, they're conventional, they've been demonstrated nationally or statewide at scale. So some of the things you might want to consider as you're looking at innovative technologies are these technologies that have been proven out at the scale that you're talking about implementing them. I want to also emphasize we have a lot more flexibility with respect to nutrients than we do our other parameters. Other parameters that are federally mandated or Utah's secondary standards that are in statute have to be met. And we have less flexibility in how we accommodate those permit limits. So, I mean, in your facilities used to dealing with BOD and TSS and E. coli and all of that. So anyway, we have more flexibility there. We do have in Rule a process for evaluating innovative technologies. I just kind of underline some of the main points here. It should be, made by a recommendation by a professional engineer licensed in Utah. We look at whether the applicant has the capital and technical resources to replace an innovative technology in the event that it fails. So we're more willing to take on that risk, and I think most cities are willing to take on that risk if they've got that sort of backup plan safety net in the event that it fails. All of the risk that's incurred with that experimentation rests with the proponent, and the applicant is on the hook for replacing any failed processes. So that's just sort of the caveats for as you look at innovative technologies. I don't want to promote any one particular technology or other technology, but there are a few that have, I know, been discussed down here in Utah County, and so I thought I'd touch on a few of those. One of them is Clear As. This is a technology that uses algae to remove nutrients. It's kind of a polishing technology that's put onto the back of a treatment plant. We're waiting to get a little bit more information about the operational reliability of this technology and also its ability to scale up and the cost scaling. The idea here is that the algae can be harvested, there's resource recovery, that it could actually pay for itself or become a profit generator for the city. We love the concept. I mean, we would love to see nutrients move from a regulatory debate to a market-based conversation. So those technologies are interesting to us, and our board did fund a project. It's about a $30 million project for a 4 million gallon a day treatment plant, South Davis Sewer District. They are using it as an add-on technology to their existing trickling filters. This facility is similarly aged to Provo City. It's from the 60s. Our board gave a $24 million loan, and the applicant's bringing $10 million. They're able to manage the flow into this part of their facility in a really steady state manner because they operate 2 facilities, so their peak flows are going to a different treatment plant. So it's a very steady state process. Again, the potential benefits here are, really high quality effluent, cost recovery, and filtration. Constructed wetlands, this is one we've discussed at length with Provo City. You guys have some property, the golf course property, that has some existing wetlands. We do allow for constructed wetlands in Utah. They can provide good polishing treatment if they're well designed and managed. As you consider them and consider the growth for the city, they can have a relatively large footprint, but maybe use a lot less energy. So it's kind of a land for energy trade. Logan has experience with treatment wetlands. They had for years used a lagoon system that's probably the largest wetland project in the state. They're now moving away from that to a mechanical plant. You'd have to talk to them about that decision. An important point, though, is that your compliance point is at the end of your treatment works. So if you have treatment wetlands, they are part of your treatment works. You can't, Clean Water Act and Utah law doesn't allow you to use natural wetlands for treatment because it's our job to protect the water quality in those wetlands as well. So you can construct new wetlands. They have to be engineered. There needs to be an inlet and an outlet. Has to be a compliance point we can measure. And so there had been, for example, some discussion of impounding some water in Provo Bay, creating duck clubs, and then using those for treatment purposes. We can't allow that. You can obviously gain some benefit from that, but the compliance point has to be before water is discharged to a water of the state. And impounded wetlands are considered both waters of the state and waters of the U.S. I know there's also been some discussion about these advanced integrated pond systems. I'm not very familiar with these. My staff tells me they have a relatively large land requirement. They're really deep ponds. And so, you know, if you're thinking about putting them out near Utah Lake, there'd be some important groundwater questions in terms of interacting with the groundwater. We'd be wanting to look at that from our groundwater permitting section. And I'm sorry I don't have a picture. This was sort of an extra slide I threw in. But we're unaware of a demonstration of this technology that provides good, consistent nutrient performance at a scale that Provo City is considering. That doesn't mean there isn't one, we're just not aware. Other innovative approaches, again, you guys have submitted for a variance request for innovative alternatives. Some things we've talked about that we are willing to entertain would be a trading scheme, perhaps between a new plant and an existing plant, if you were going to do your phased option. So you would then, we'd have to work out a permit that would basically bring you to 1 milligram per liter as an average. That would be a commensurate reduction. So you might have 2 milligrams per liter at your existing plant and 0.1 at your new plant, or 1.5 and 0.5, or however you would balance those flows out. That kind of trading is allowable under the rule, and we are willing to entertain that. That's something that's of interest to the city. You could also consider trading with another partner in the Utah Lake watershed. You've got several communities to the south, Spanish Fork, Springville, Payson, that also need to meet this limit. There's a possibility of trading there. If you have 2 willing partners, we're willing to consider those kind of innovative options. Other things that we've discussed would be a portion of the water used for land application or water reuse. We have water reuse rules to allow for that sort of a permit, and that would be removing the phosphorus entirely from the system. So you would get a credit, and if you go below the 1 milligram per liter, below what you need to, you would have the option to sell those credits to another community that might be willing to buy them. Other innovative projects for commensurate reduction could be, like I was saying, a trading scheme with your stormwater or with agriculture. Yeah.
So those trades, would they need to be going into the same body of water?
Yes, typically. So it gets harder the further away you are.
Particularly if we're talking Provo Bay separate from the rest of Utah Lake.
Yeah. But you've got Springville going into Provo Bay as well. And we could look at, I mean, it depends who's doing which direction the trade's going. So, you know, you typically, if you're going to have somebody upstream of you treat to a higher level, then you're going to get that benefit all the way downstream. So we would prefer that to the reverse.
Well, related to that, what's the proportion of water we're responsible for? I would imagine
Provo City.
Because of Provo River, our overall volume is much higher. So,
right.
Does that get factored in?
It does. So all of that. I mean, we would be talking about this kind of as a load trade. So we would calculate what total load you need to meet at 1 milligram per liter at your current flow, permitted flow. And then if you wanted to reduce from there or discharge at a higher level, we would ask you to find that commensurate load reduction somewhere else. It could be stormwater, could be another community, could be your other treat if you would had 2 facilities. It does get tricky when we've got Provo Bay in a kind of different dynamic than the rest of Utah Lake.
I wanted to ask another question that was probably more on the question of phosphorus levels and projections.
Yeah.
Future regulations. I don't understand the difference in impact on those levels in comparing agriculture to residential housing.
Yep.
So
in terms of proportion.
Yeah. So for example, as we're thinking about you know, whether or not we want to develop the west of Provo, which areas in the west of Provo we want to develop. Presumably that will have some kind of impact on the phosphorus levels, but I don't have a clear sense of, like, you take 10 acres of agriculture and turn it into 10 acres of housing, what happens to the phosphorus levels?
Well, it depends a lot on how you do that development. But big picture, let me just say, and I get in trouble every time I quote these numbers, our study that we did in 2004 found about 3/4 of the load coming from wastewater. And maybe it's a little bit lower than that. Maybe it's 60 or 70%. I don't know. That'll be one of the questions the science panel looks at. We've done our own kind of rough calculations of stormwater sources in Utah County. We think that's on the order of 10 to 15%. And the balance of the load would be coming from agriculture and natural sources. So just to give you kind of a sense. Now, obviously, as you start developing, that's going to change to become stormwater becoming more important. I'd love to come back to the council and to Public Works and talk more about stormwater. We have some really great initiatives. We're working with the Home Builders Association. They're down here meeting with them a couple weeks ago to talk about our construction stormwater program. We're really pushing low impact development, and the home builders love it because it's cheaper and it keeps the water on the landscape, so you get less runoff, and that can have a huge impact on phosphorus loading, nutrient loading, sediment loading, all of it, E. coli. So that's a big effort, and I'd be happy to come back and talk to you more about that, because we really do need good municipal partners in that effort. Do you have a question? Another thing I know has been discussed by a number of people down here is this idea of a private-public partnership. So somebody comes in and pays for a new treatment plant, and how does that work with private investors? And so, you know, our take on this hasn't really been done much in Utah. It's a hot topic nationally, this concept, they call it P3, public-private partnerships. Certainly there's the potential for increased investment into Utah's water infrastructure, so we don't want to just shut the door on it. But I think the main point for the city to be aware of is we issue discharge permits to body politics. And so, you know, if you want to finance your project with private financing and you want to contract with a private entity to run your wastewater treatment plant, I think we can work that out, knowing that the responsibility ultimately still falls to the city. So the permit's issued to the city, not to a private entity. And you've got to be comfortable with that risk and make sure that whatever contractual obligations you have with a private entity are such that you feel comfortable that if there's a violation that you're going to be able to handle it. Because the notice of violation would be written to the city, not to the private entity. So just be aware of that. You know, we're interested to better understand kind of the long-term security of some of these financing options. I haven't seen enough details from some of the folks that are talking about these projects to really understand where the money's coming from and the long-term commitment. So that's all I'll say on that. I'm happy to answer questions. It's really not something we've seen a lot in Utah. We're not fully opposed to it. We would just caution you to just be aware that you still own all of the liability. And then finally, I can't do a presentation without talking about integrated water resources management. We are more and more seeing how important it is for us to look at water quality in the context of water quantity, in the context of climate change and lake levels and changes in water rights. And so more and more we're looking for opportunities, and I think the city is as well, to manage our water holistically and be as smart as we can with the decisions that we're making. So we're working closely with our sister agencies in DNR to look for opportunities to really find those links within existing law. One thing that you should be aware of is this concept of integrated permitting. We're starting to have conversations with Salt Lake City. We've been working on it with Park City. The idea here is that we permit all of your water-related infrastructure together. So it's coordinated permitting, stormwater, wastewater, and sometimes even in Park City, drinking water as well. It's a new concept to Utah as well, but it's something that we're willing to entertain. All right, this is where it gets fun. So we have some funding to talk about. So we have what's called the State Revolving Loan Fund. We call it the SRF Program. This is a permanent funding source. It was set up as part of the Clean Water Act back in the 70s. It provides a permanent funding source for water quality projects, capital projects, supplement a community's own resources. We use it to support projects with the highest water quality benefits and infrastructure needs. We have a prioritization process for that, and I'll talk a bit about some of the factors. So we only fund projects that are body politic projects, so we wouldn't give a loan to a private entity for a wastewater treatment plant. The city is eligible. We fund treatment plants, we fund sewer projects, we fund all parts of the infrastructure of wastewater, and we can stormwater as well. Really support the concept of regionalization. So this fund was used to really regionalize in Salt Lake County. There used to be, I don't know how many different treatment plants, 10 plus, that got regionalized into Central Valley, South Valley districts. So our board really likes to see regional projects. And we can fund studies and planning projects that are associated with capital projects as well. Typically, we don't fund operation, maintenance, and repairs. Low priority projects, development-driven projects, and there's a nuance there between growth and development. Projects that result in deregionalization. So we've seen some applicants that want to split a treatment plant and go to smaller treatment plants. We really encourage regionalization, and then we try to stay out of projects that the community opposes. So if this is too much detail, I'm happy to skip through it, but Dave asked that we really kind of dive into the mechanics of our loan program. So we have a number of different sources to our loan program. We get a federal capitalization grant every year from the federal government in the amount of about $7 million. We get a 16th, well, no, we don't. We get a portion of a 16th of state sales tax. It goes to water infrastructure. We get about $2.5 million from that. We use that as a match. We have to provide a match to the federal funding. We have loan repayments that come into this fund right now about $15 million per year. So on average, we're getting about $24.5 million per year added into our revolving loan fund. Currently, our unobligated balance across these funds is about just over $100 million. But keep in mind, we get another 24.5 every year. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the strings attached to this money. We call it first round money. That's the money that comes directly from our capitalization grant. Second round money is money that's been loaned out once and returned to the fund, and the strings are a little bit fewer. And then the Utah Wastewater Loan Program, this is the state match to the federal program. We do have a way to carve out a piece of the interest from the state funds and from our second round money that creates a hardship grant fund. This is the fund that's paying for the Utah Lake water quality study. It's also a fund that some communities are able to tap into when they really are in a hardship and can't afford a loan. So
are those funds based, the hardship fund based on cities or residents? The amount the city has in a general fund, for example, or the amount that the income of the community?
It's the income of the community. So we typically look at the sewer rates against the median annual gross income, adjusted gross income for the city. So, and it's a 1.4% threshold that our board typically looks at. Although recently they have, for some rural communities, looked at other metrics of hardship. So they have some flexibility there. I'll talk a little bit more about hardship here in a second. Just in terms of process, if you're interested in this, the process is this, and Ken can dive into the details here if you have more questions. But first, we would scope out the project with the city. We need applications in 6 weeks before our scheduled board meeting. Our board meets once a month, the last Wednesday of the month, 8:30 or 9:30 in the morning, depending on whether we have a work meeting. You have to decide if you want a planning advance. We can offer communities planning advances to help pay for the design or planning. You've kind of already through a lot of that work. Then you do a project introduction to our board. And that's where we go. We kind of explain the details of the project, get the board up to speed. We present feasibility report, the alternatives that you've considered, where your project falls in terms of priority with other projects in the state, and the city's capital facilities plan. Then we come back to the board, usually the next month, for loan authorization. And that's where the board makes a decision about interest rates, loan terms, whether you qualify for hardship grant. At that point, you can also decide whether you want to qualify for a design advance. And then we go through our permitting process. For construction, we bid the project out, secure the financing, and then close the loan. Then you construct a project. So some considerations. It's important for you to know that the Water Quality Board has the ultimate authority on rates and loan terms. Our staff makes recommendations to the board. Often they take staff recommendations, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they change our recommendations. And I'll give you some tips on some of the things we've been seeing that our board's especially mindful of lately. In terms of loan requirements, if you are taking first round SRF money, you have to follow all of these requirements. So you have to look for minority women business enterprises. You have an audit requirement. The big one that people worry about is you have to use American iron and steel. That's required, it's a federal requirement. And Davis-Bacon wages, which hasn't been as big a problem. It's more the steel costs. Second round SRF money has those second two requirements. And I'll talk about kind of how we determine rates, how our board determines rates. If you take first round funding, they'll often discount your rate because of the strings attached to that particular funding source. Our loans have been anywhere from 0 to 3%. We've given some communities 0% loans where they meet the hardship requirements. In the last 5 years, the highest rate has been 2.8, on average 0.91. Last 10 years, you can see here, highest is 3, on average about just over 1%. Typical repayment schedules are 20 years, but we can go as much as 30 years. It's really the life of the asset. Our loan program can fund complete projects, the entire project, the planning, the design, the construction, or we can fund portions of it. And there are several facilities we are aware of that are doing some bonding and then are coming to us for a portion of the funding. Okay, so some things that the board considers in your finance package. So we start out with kind of the market rate, the AA revenue bond rate. That's kind of the starting point. So market rates do matter. And then from there, we discount for a number of reasons. The board has really been looking carefully at fiscal sustainability. The board does not want to be seen as, well, one of our board members often calls himself Santa Claus. They want to be supporting communities that have done a good job planning, that are fiscally responsible, that have reasonable rate structures, that have asset management plans. They look favorably to applicants that bring a local contribution, and they especially look at impact fees for new developed areas. Our loan program cannot fund new development, so new development needs to pay for itself through impact fees or rates or however you structure that, and our board looks at that pretty carefully. Hardship. So we can provide some portion of the finance package as grant, or what's called principal forgiveness, which is effectively grant out of the SRF program. Or a lower interest rate to those hardship communities. And again, as I said before, it's typically defined as rates over 1.4%. Provo, looking at your rate structure that you have, that you submitted as part of your variance, will trip that 1.4% in fiscal year 20. So you're about 2 or 3 years away from hitting that hardship threshold. There are other hardship conditions that the board has considered on a case-by-case basis, especially in rural Utah, where this particular metric may not be as helpful. We also can provide discounts for what EPA defines as green projects. So these would be projects. Now, everyone knows that wastewater treatment is a green project. That is true, but we don't give extra credit for that. So you get extra credit if you do something beyond that. So energy efficiency, resource recovery, something that's innovative, water efficiency, green infrastructure. And then again, taking that first round money because of those additional strings attached to those funds, we often look at another discount. So I can't tell you what your rate will be, but I think you qualify for a lot of these factors. Yeah.
So what have you seen as creative ways to reuse the effluent?
Not a lot. I mean, we've seen a few. The South Davis project, I would call it reuse, but resource recovery in terms of capturing the nutrients and selling them as algae. We do have some projects that have done land applications. So if you have, especially in some of the rural parts of the state, smaller communities where you've got agricultural partners where you can dispose of wastewater on land.
So
Of others?
this has been approached by the local refineries to take their effluent as being many industries look at recycled water as being travel-proof. Treatment plant always flows, so it's very attractive to any industry that's under pressures from the local water boards for their usage. We do have a number of communities that have discussed replacing their secondary irrigation system or augmenting it with recycled water. So there are a number of communities around, including Fairview, just over the hill here from you, is looking at that. Those are probably the most popular, and then of course irrigating golf courses and things like that are very common reuse projects that are done. Central Valley does it, St. George does it, and so those projects have been done around the state. Nationally, indirect potable reuse has been happening in places like Southern California, Arizona. There's not many direct potable reuses. Mostly communities aren't very interested in that. Most people are most interested in the agricultural type uses that may be available to free up a water source now. And of course, Utah, we get very, I don't know the proper term for it, but water rights is a very heavy discussion. Since we have some of the most stringent water right laws in the country, that's always a heavy discussion for individuals.
Car washes use reclaimed water? Or not a,
We typically recycle water through, but not from a wastewater treatment.
With the delivery problems,
yeah, that's,
how do you distribute it? Get it back.
Really all I've got. So happy to have more discussion and answer some questions. But our take-home message is, again, we consider the city to be a really important partner as we work to restore Utah Lake. We'd be really pleased to work on a financing package with you. These uncertainties in the regulatory landscape will continue to try and provide clarity, but to a large extent, they're unpreventable. There will always be something new that comes from the federal regs, or science tells us something new and things change. So I guess our message would be that we encourage you to select a robust technology soon that allows you to grow and accommodate these potential future regulations. We encourage innovation within the bounds of your risk tolerance and our laws. And we think we'll be able to provide a lot more certainty on the nutrient limits in 2023 with implementation in 2030. So with that, I'm happy to talk more. I know Dave's got a presentation as well.
You'd listed earlier in one of your slides that there was about $25 million coming into the fund every year, but you had a base right now about 105. How much could a city like Provo access if you met all the requirements?
First come, first serve, I guess is what I'd say. And that would really be up to the board. I can tell you that probably the largest loan we've done is Logan City. They got a $70 million loan at a 0.75% interest rate. Can't promise that would be the same, but that's probably the most comparable recent loan. Another city with a large university, similar sort of magi issues. And, as you think about your project, when you come in and when you close, there could be more funding in there. I do have, we put out an intended use plan every year of how we, projects that we anticipate. And we did put in 40 million as a possible placeholder for Provo City. But the total in that list exceeds our existing resources.
You talked about the 1.4% of the median adjusted gross income to the sewer rates, and how we're projected to cross that in 2 years. If we shuffle our rate increases, because every model I've seen that we've looked at that's just the beginning of our rate increases, and we're going up high. Would it be helpful if we just shifted that around a little bit so we cross that threshold earlier
think it depends on when, and I'll let Ken answer too, but it kind of depends on when you come in for a loan. If you're not going to come in for 2 more years, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. I think probably the board would look favorably on, you know, being more aggressive in rates and demonstrating that you've done everything you can to fund yourself.
Yeah.
They do look favorably. I don't know if you have anything more, Ken, on that.
I think knowing that forecasting is a very important piece. That's actually the most important piece, knowing that this is what we've examined and coming into the board and saying, we've already aggressively reset our sewer rates to address what we foresee as being our needs. That's the most powerful thing. So if you come in with your rate study and show that you don't need to tinker with things today just to push your loan, you know, keep in mind our grant fund, I believe, has about $1 million in it today. So back to your question a little bit, size does matter. Obviously, with a $40–60 million loan, $1 million in grant doesn't go very far versus often with a small community. $500,000 in grant can make all the difference in the world. So with a larger loan, oftentimes we're more able to look at the rate and come in on that side of things on trying to help out a community. And that's part of what got Logan its deal, basically, from the board was coming in, and I think they ended up somewhere around 1.7, 1.75 possibly. And of course, our funding package can also alter some of that. So there's some intent there as you look at how we're funding this upgrade and what that rate does to what the forecasted that's another intent.
So the fund's up over 100 million, but the grant portion of that is
Only one.
Only 1 million. We do have principal forgiveness though. That's
principal forgiveness is moving all the time and restarts. So that's possible out there.
I would, as Ken said, think more about the interest rates than the grant possibility. And there are some, just so you're aware, and you can look at our intended use plan, there are a number of other very large capital projects that are kind of on the same time horizon. So
You mentioned strings attached, and then you had those 4. Are those 4 of the basic strings attached then?
and then dealing with Ken.
That's another number 5, Kym.
Yeah,
Okay.
There can be a few more, like federal procurement rules, depending on a few items that you may have to follow. So engineering services is a big one that comes into discussions with city councils. If we're funding the procurement of engineering services for design, then it must follow federal procurement rules. Unless we're doing it with state money, which is the approach that we often take, we'll sometimes mix our money. So we might come in and fund the engineering services with state money and fund the rest of the project with the federal money. Or many communities just choose to bring their local contribution as their engineering services, and then that's used following the local procurement rules, and then the other piece is funded federally. So there's a number of ways that we can mix that and move things around a little bit that may accommodate the desires of a community in this council.
Just for clarification, if the city did not fund the planning and design with grant money or with state loan, but just went through construction, do we follow federal procurement on the construction also, or is it just the 4? It's
The engineering, yeah.
Yeah.
That procurement, I had it on here, and then it seems like you're already funding your engineering independently or on your own. So
Just follow your local.
it's really the American Iron and Steel that seems to be the cost increase, and we try to pay for that in some ways with the interest rate.
Eric, on the variance, the 3.5 phosphorus starting in 2020.
Yep.
That's an annual average.
Yep.
Will that monitoring mirror our current nutrient monthly to
Yep.
30 days?
Yep. So it'll be a 12, an average of 12 points.
Our intent with that limit really is, so currently you've been doing monthly monitoring. Our desire is if you get a high value, just like any other sample that you might have a limit on for monthly average, for example, is, go check out why did I get a high phosphorus value. respond, do additional sampling, see if you've gone down. Because it will be an annual average, you'll be able to average that monthly value into your reporting and then average that. So it's our hope that is not a stringent requirement. It's just we'd like everyone to pay attention to phosphorus who has a variance. And we think that
Do what you can.
past data you should be easily able to meet that limit as you can.
Thank you. What kind of confidence do we have in the 1 milligram per liter level in terms of its effectiveness for preventing algae blooms?
Quite frankly, we really do see it as holding the line given the growth potential. So because it's a concentration, it's still going to allow for loads to increase over time as your flow increases. So that graph I showed, with the 1 milligram per liter, we'll be back to where we were in 2000 by 2040 or 50. So I would not consider, I wouldn't be thinking that 1 milligram per liter is likely the solution to the algal issues in Utah Lake. I don't know, and I know that's not a very satisfying answer. I don't know what that number is, but our study will answer that. And I don't know if it's just phosphorus or if it will also be nitrogen. We're gonna look at both.
You mentioned how much is in the lake water itself. And is that tested, have you tested it like after a big storm when it all gets churned up on the lake bed?
We've done some of that, but we need to do more of that. And we've seen numbers jump, and this is just from my memory. So at the average on a calm day after, things have settled is between 0.04, 0.05 and up to maybe 0.08. We have seen big events where we get up to 1 or 2 milligrams per liter, which is more equivalent to what you're putting out of your treatment plants. So understanding that dynamic and how important that is in fueling algal blooms is important. Often we have seen those high numbers associated with blooms. And so certainly part of this solution to the lake is understanding the internal cycling and perhaps even addressing some of the sediment-bound phosphorus, which is, phosphorus behaves kind of like a metal. It's different than nitrogen. 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So nitrogen you put into the lake over time will make its way back to the atmosphere through microbial processes. Phosphorus doesn't do that. So every kilogram of phosphorus that's ever been discharged from Provo City is either in Utah Lake or in the Jordan River or in the Great Salt Lake, except for the bits that come out as brine shrimp or fish. So, if you think of it that way, there's a large reserve in these 3 water bodies, not just from Provo, but from the entire Wasatch Front. And it is an important question that we will address in our studies. What do we do about that? Do we wait? In deeper reservoirs, often if you wait 10 years, cleaner sediments cover it up and it sort of caps the phosphorus in the sediment. In a shallow lake like Utah Lake, we'll have to really understand that. Is it appropriate to do some selective dredging in hot spots? Would that be part of the restoration? How much faster could we recover the lake if we were to take on that kind of a project? Those will be questions we look at.
Follow-up question. So it would seem like there's a relationship between how much is on the lake bed and how much is dissolved in the water. After a storm, it's all out of whack, but then it gets back to the equilibrium.
Right. Yep.
And so, we're putting in a certain amount, but there's just an enormous amount that's sitting there. And that would seem to, and it would seem that might be the main factor in determining what's in the water on a regular basis.
I think you're probably right. We will have our science panel look at that question. But keep in mind that what was the original source of the phosphorus in that sediment was largely these same sources we're talking about. So the way we kind of think about it is kind of stop the bleeding first and then trying to heal the patient. So, over time, and the sedimentation rates in Utah Lake are not minuscule. If you're putting out cleaner water into the lake over time, you could bury some of that and diminish the amount that's coming out. But I can't tell you the answer until we do our study.
Would dredging make a difference?
It could. And that is something we'll be investigating. Now, I know there's been talk about dredging 5 feet. Do we need to dredge 5 feet for water quality reasons? I don't think so. I mean, when we've looked at the cores in Utah Lake, we're talking about a foot perhaps where we have elevated levels of nutrients in particular parts of the lake. So I wouldn't be thinking of it as a lake-wide, massive dredging project, but Provo Bay perhaps, where we've got concentrated nutrients in the sediment. Maybe there's areas there that would be appropriate. Once you get into dredging, then you're talking about, we're gonna have to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service on June Sucker and talk with Corps of Engineers on 404 permitting. So it's complicated, but if it's part of the solution, it's certainly something we want to look at. There's other treatment techniques, lake-wide treatment techniques that have been used in other places, and we're willing to explore some of those, but they're not an alternative to putting better water into the lake, but they could be a good companion to the total solution. And we're open to all of that. Yeah. Any other questions I can answer for you?
Thank you very much for coming.
Gary's got one.
If we go with the new treatment plant, how long does the permitting process take for your office? We haven't really addressed that. How long is it?
About 6 months, Kim, is that right?
Is that right? That's the minimum. You move your discharge application to take 9 months.
Yeah.
So I'm back to finance a little bit. It seems like the amount of money you have available, and there are some demands for it. You mentioned 2 or 3 other projects that are substantial. I think I heard discussion back in Washington with the new funding for big projects. Do you foresee that your amount increasing? Was there any legislation that's been passed yet that's?
So the president's budget and the congressional budgets that we've seen, obviously nothing's passed. So we're just on continuing budgets for now. This program is the only EPA program that isn't cut in the president's budget, and I think is even increased a little bit. But we haven't realized any of that yet because we don't have a new budget. What I can tell you though is that the WIFIA, and I have to look up what that means, is a kind of complement to the SRF program that's managed by EPA headquarters to fund really large projects that our state revolving funds just can't accommodate. So we could look at that. I know that the governor's office has been looking for opportunities to try and tap into that really quite large water infrastructure fund. So, I mean, if you wanted to bring, your full project, and we're talking above $100 million project or 200 million, I don't know where you are, I'd be willing to look into that with our EPA partners. That's not a fund that Utah's tapped into yet, but it's a really new fund as well. Yeah.
As far as the approval, are you expected to almost immediately start drawing those funds down? Because normally if you're trying to plan for a project, sometimes, almost always, it's years in advance. And so is there any way that you can be approved and then, or is there a time limit as far as once you're approved?
Yeah, I mean, what I talked about, the 105, isn't the balance, it's our unobligated balance. So we have a number of projects that are either first authorized and then it's closed. Then, I mean, I don't think Logan's drawn down much.
You need to have design finished in order to close. So a big piece of it is when will you close? So we have a lot of obligated funds out there, like South Davis we spoke about. Well, they were authorized a year ago. They're just wrapping up their design and getting ready to bid right now. Once they're to that point, we'll close that loan. So we're about a month away. They were authorized February of last year, closing now. So that's kind of a typical lead. A few communities kind of drag behind or hit obstacles and take longer to close. But that is an important thing with the fund of, sort of what year of money do you become the obligation for? Because you will, and the draw schedule also matters. You're not going to take out all the funds. You're actually going to draw progressively, and then when is the first payment due? It's usually a year after finishing construction. So there are a few other things in there that kind of play in your favor since this program was so exactly set up for your project, pretty much.
And quite frankly, it's our job to get these dollars on the ground in Utah. We want to see these funds used, and we see this project as really high priority for the state. So, once you've made a decision of which direction you're going to go and you have a better idea of whether you're building a new treatment plant or upgrading your existing or doing some sort of combination, I'd encourage you public works folks to come in and sit down with Ken and John Mackey, who runs our engineering section, and work out some options. We can run scenarios. We'll work with you, because it's in both of our interests to see this project happen and to make good use of these federal and state funds. Any other questions? I'll hang out here. We'll just hang out in the back, and if anything else comes up, feel free to ask.
Thank you.
All right, so we wanted to talk today about some of the decision points that are ahead of the council and administration, some of the information we think that you need in order to make those decisions, and just some of the work we've done since we last met a month ago. So, first decision point that we're relying on the council for in late next month or early May, to make a decision about whether we construct a new facility, regardless of site, or to rehabilitate the existing plant. One of those big pieces of that could drive that decision is whether or not we pursue one of these loans from the state. So we have tried to incorporate some potential options that could utilize that funding that we'll review, and that's primarily what I'll be discussing in my section of the presentation.
Question?
Yes.
John, it doesn't affect our bond rating at all, whether we go one way or the other, does it? Still there.
So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the financial update. A lot of it is stuff you've seen before. We want to make sure we just review quickly what we've already talked about and update you on what we've done since we last met. So I bring this up as we talk at the beginning stages. We just want to talk about the assumptions that are included in each of the options that we're going to look at. This is a preliminary design of a potential phase-in of a treatment plant. This is on the west side, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in that location. It's just, this is the same. These are some of the assumptions that we've used for phasing in the plant or building a new plant. It would most likely look like this, either all at once, if we did a full plant at once, or in phases as they're colored here, one at a time. And then the rest of, another big piece of our financial outlook is to fund the main backbone of our sewer infrastructure on the west side. And this has been ongoing planning since our last master plan, and our current planning that we're doing through Horrocks Engineering has changed that. Some things have happened, like the high school on the west side, that have impacted those plans from when we initially did this in the master plan. But the funding of these core pieces of infrastructure on the west side are included in our assumptions. So these are a few of the other assumptions. We're forecasting out about 30 years. We're assuming some increases to our annual operating expenses. And in our 30-year bond option, we're using a 2.8% interest rate, which is a little bit higher than what we got on our 2015 bonds. And then we have one option that we presented last time, or two options we presented that had short-term loans that were 5-year loans at 1.5%. So I'm going to quickly go through, one more item we wanted to discuss was a few of the assumptions that are not included in our options. And I'll come back to this at the end and talk about some of the, I guess, the scale and scope of some of these potential assumptions that we probably need to take into account. So, like I said, I'll come back to these. So our first option was pay-as-you-go, where we would phase the construction of a new facility, like the image that I had up here earlier. We would fund it as we were able to, based on the rate increase plan that we've developed. It would require us to continue to maintain the existing facility, but we would want to make minimal improvements there and put as much money toward the new plant and the new trains as possible. And that would get us, in that option, 6 million gallons by 2025, which would require us to do the balancing of nutrients between the two plants, like was mentioned in the state's presentation. So this shows the average monthly bill. It would require quite a jump at the beginning in order to get that funding coming in to start saving up, and it would taper off or level off in the outer years and require a few smaller increases. This is our fund balance chart, just to show that we're with those rate increases, we're able to keep the fund balance above zero. And at the end of 2044, when we finish all the phases, our fund balance jumps because we don't have those huge capital costs anymore. The next option was a one short-term loan. The assumption we made was $80 million, paid back over 5 years. It would be 3.6 million in interest, and the $80 million would go towards $60 million for the first train, I guess the first phase, which would be 6 million gallons, and $20 million for the west side sewer trunk lines. Our short-term loan, and we'd have to pay once we get the short-term loan paid off. We're still also during that time saving up for the next phase. But we're getting to the point where we're paying that back fast enough. We're not having very much interest that our after that initial jump, we could potentially drop off back down to keep the fund balance, as shown here. It's a little crazy graph, but it just shows that we're just trying to minimize the rate increases going up and down for easy. It's a lot easier to see that way. Another option we looked at was 2 short-term loans. Doing a $20 million 5-year loan just to get the west side infrastructure going, and then doing $60 million in 2025 to do the treatment plant. And you can see the interest for those 2 loans. It would require quite a bit higher jump to fund those sooner and pay them off so fast. And again, would level off. We did drop a little bit below zero in that option, but again, once all the trains are done, there's a big jump in fund balance. This is the big option that would fund a treatment plant and all 20 million of the west side core infrastructure at once. It would be in our assumptions, and in this option, it's a 30-year bond in 2020 that would construct $240 million of infrastructure and would have $118 million in interest using the assumption I showed earlier, which is just a little bit higher, 2.8, which is a little bit higher than we got in our bonds in 2015. It spreads out the cost of the $240 million over the life of the 30 years. And there's a big jump in fund balance when we get that upfront capital, and drops off as we build the plant. The last option that we discussed last month was to refurbish the existing treatment plant. So in this option, we assumed a $50 million 5-year loan and to do the west side infrastructure, as well as institute chemical treatment at the existing plant by 2020. Because if we went this route, we wouldn't have the variance, which would allow us to not meet it until 2050 or 2025, and that $50 million would have to be spent before 2020 as far as at least the treatment plant portion in order to meet that. And that $50 million would be about 2.3 million in interest. So the monthly bill in that scenario stays near $80 once we get up to that level. And the graph is all over the place because we have such different capital expenditures throughout the years to replace the things that are existing plant when we anticipate them needing to be replaced. So this is just an option to compare all of them together. You see that the two short-term loans where it jumps up and then stays second highest. That's one that in the next few slides I'll show you. I've replaced that option with an option that's probably closer to what some of the other cities have done with the state. That's what we'll focus on next. This is really hard to read, but it just shows all the options together. So again, this was intended to be just an introduction to our understanding of the state fund. You've gotten a lot more information about it today that addresses these issues. I had the information I was able to find had a little bit different information on Logan City. I think you showed their interest rate was one. Okay, that's correct. So it's the interest rates and the dollar amounts for two large recent projects.
So how does that balance out? You're going to have more expense on the top end because of Davis Bacon and buying American steel or whatever versus lower interest. So your interest rate or payments could be significantly lower.
Yeah, that's correct. So it would have more of a long-term effect on the repayment. We'd have lower interest over the course of the project, but it would probably require a higher jump in the beginning to either do the match from the city or to get a higher dollar amount from the maximize the amount of money we were getting from the state to be able to cover those increased costs.
If it's helpful, we've seen about a 10% increase as a result of the Buy American. So you can kind of factor that in when we try to pay for that with the interest rate.
And it seems the bulk of the contractors who are doing this work are already paying the Davis Bacon wages, so we haven't seen much impact from that locally.
Perhaps I missed that, but potential for Davis Bacon and Buy American, could the project be enough higher that it would more than offset the interest? It would seem interest is 1 or 2%, 3%, and then your construction cost is 20 or 30% higher. It's going to be a lot more money.
Oh, that's what you were just saying. That your experience is it's not 20 to 30% higher.
Maybe
You said 20%?
we've seen more like
10%.
10.
What happens when you have a $200 million project and let's say 70 million of it is financed through this state funding and then the others financed from another source or pay as you go? Does that basically encumber the entire project so everything has to be Davis Bacon, or is it just a portion that's paid through the state funding?
Very often what we do is we end up cutting out a piece of the project.
Okay.
So we fund something very specific to the project, and a piece, the clarifiers, or the activated sludge portion, or we cut out that portion. You can imagine the scope of a large project that's fairly feasible. We just focus on that. But occasionally there's some creep, possibly the environmental, but we often don't have problems with environmental. It's on one footprint. So.
I'm not sure who can answer this, but I mean, do we need to decide on the technology of the plant before we make this decision? I mean, it seems to me if we're looking at that algae option, for example, that's incompatible with a refurbished plant, I assume, or no?
Well, I think that one of our arguments is that algae is sort of a polishing element, not a treatment technology of itself. A component, perhaps.
Okay.
Your engineers probably.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to figure out, I mean, we're talking about different financial plans, but if we haven't decided which kind of a plant we want, deciding on which kind of plant we want might actually limit what kind of financial options we have, right, or no?
I don't think that we would have limits on your financial options based on the kind of plan you have. You would need to figure that out before you came in. So we mentioned there's the introduction in front of the board. So you need to have your technology selected. You need to know where you're going and what you're doing at that time. So you should have at least a rough budget, together of what it's going to cost. And sometimes communities come back at that authorization meeting and have sharpened their pencil a little bit more over the month. That's intended for the board to get the chance to sort of research what the project is, or it might come and talk to city council members. They often do their own outreach. Once we introduce you to the board, it's kind of in their ballpark to reach out. The division is not to basically promote a project beyond taking you in front of the board. That's our board's chance to make their decision, and when we come back for that authorization, they're authorizing you for a specific treatment with specific components. You may say, if you say I'm doing UV, they're going to expect UV to be in the project. Down to that sort of level of, are you doing drying? Are you doing centrifuges? Are you?
But there are elements that could affect the interest rate if they were to do green infrastructure or resource recovery or water efficiency. Could affect your rate a little bit.
Could I ask the question just a little bit differently? Could the city start the process, the application, whatever paperwork needs to be done for, for a grant or application for a loan without knowing exactly the technology that we're going to use, and how soon after the application started do we have to nail down exactly the technology that we're going to use?
Typically the technology, you select it. So usually how we would handle that is from some sort of planning advance where you figure it out. And that kind of gives the board an introduction to the project. You've done a lot of that work.
So it sounds to me like we kind of need to know the direction we're going before we start the application.
You could. So for the planning advance, you would come in front of the board and say you're looking at this and that you're going to do a capital facilities plan. And with that capital facilities plan, you would not only analyze, right now you're kind of faced with where do we want to put this? The capital facility plan would really analyze what are the treatment options out there. They could analyze the separate locations and be very robust, or you could narrow it. That's a little bit in the council's domain, I think. But it could be very broad and analyze everything there. And or it could be narrowed where you're just saying we're doing a new project, new plant, and just analyzing what treatment technologies could we go with for that.
David, let me ask you a question. You've already decided to have chosen technology. Should have. We're not capable as a council of deciding. I'm gonna look to your department to tell us what you think's best.
I'm going to actually cover that when Jimmy's done. We'll talk a little bit about innovative technologies. And we've done a lot of planning. The aspect that that Erica and her staff are talking about. We've done a lot of the planning, but there are several steps. And it sounds like most of those steps need to be completed before we start the application process for that.
But maybe what we could do is have you come in and work out some scenarios. I mean, it sounds like what you're needing is to know, are you going to get the Logan deal? Are you going to get something different? And we don't know that's what we're looking for. But maybe we could work out some scenarios of, if it shows this is the kind of package we would typically recommend to the board. Look at a couple of things. We're willing to help however it's helpful, but I do think pretty soon period.
Based on your assumptions. So my question is, if the city were to take one of these loans, how soon after, or can you get a second loan at some future date while you're still paying off the first one?
Yeah. And some people come in and refinance their own loan, old loans occasionally too. We've done that before too.
I'll go ahead now, unless there's any other questions on this, to show the option that we developed. It seems to fit more in line with the type of projects we were showing that have received state funding recently. We have kept our 1.5% rate increase, which may be high, but it sounds like it might be close to the average for 20 years. But I just want you to know that's what's in there, and sounds like there's potential to be lower than that. We've kept the $80 million assumption. We've changed the one loan option to be 20 years instead of 5, and this just shows the interest over 20 years at that rate. That 1.5% for $80 million would be $13 million. So this shows the average monthly bill. I'll bring up the comparison again with the other options here shortly. I guess the point here is that with $80 million, it's not enough to do the full plant. We're just doing the first phase. And so while we're paying off the loan, we're also saving up, to do pay-as-you-go with the rest of the financing. And so that does continue to climb. But what happens with the loan, the 20-year loan, is that it gives us a little bit more time to increase those rates up to where they're reaching this $90 limit level. It does go a little bit higher and has the potential to drop off in the future. But I think the most telling graph will be the one that shows the comparison here. So I don't know if you can see that, but I guess this just shows the green line, which is that latest option we did. I've replaced the 2 short-term loan over 5 years option with this 1 short-term loan over 20 years. Shows that that would enable us to raise rates at a slower pace. We would eventually surpass the other options and see what goes on in the future as we're paying off the loan, and then continue to save up for the rest of the projects to implement the full treatment plant. Yes.
Before you go on, so just help me out with the assumptions one more time. So none of this has inflation-based into it. This is all in 2018 dollars.
Right.
And so we were projecting to cross that affordability threshold in 2020. So that's probably somewhere around $55 or so.
Yeah,
50 something dollars. So what we're looking at here, the way that goes up in 2040, we're projecting that we're going to be nearly twice what the current affordability standard is. I just trying to wrap my head around what that graph says. And I guess it's a policy question for the council, but the sooner we raise rates, the lower the peak amount has to be. And is that something that we're willing to look at, that we pay a little bit more now? And yes, I mean, anytime rates go up, it's painful, but a part of that's been a function of underfunding for decades. But what if we just, anyway, it's just a discussion to have. Maybe we look to increase them a little bit faster and bring down that ultimate peak, that our kids are going to be paying when they're at a hard station in life.
So when I look at the 1 year short term out of that maroon color, it goes up really fast. It goes up to almost $90. That's a really fast, horrible hit. I mean, people would be complaining and impacted, and then it levels out there. I kind of like the one, 20-year loan, where it goes up gradually and it does peak out a little higher, but it comes back down, and in the end, it's right down there with the lowest when you're at the 2050. So there's pluses and minuses, but a gradual increase as hopefully wages go up, because that if you go up too fast, you're going to outpace anybody's ability to pay for it.
As wages go up, so does inflation, so all of these numbers will go anyway. But these numbers are really going to be far above what inflation is going to go, because you're not going to triple anybody's salaries in the next 10 years.
And the other thing to consider, I imagine, public works, I mean, we're just trying to compare things across the life of these loans. But by the time we're hitting 2040, we're looking at a major remodel anyway. And there's going to be other infrastructure needs for wastewater that, you know, I don't think our rates are ever going to come down.
Can you clarify? You talked about, you've got the green line and the purple line. The green line is the one short-year 20 or one short-term 80 million 20-year loan. And then you're saying that based on that, the rates that you'd be charging, you're basically turning it then after the first 80 million into a pay-as-you-go?
Yes.
Okay, versus taking the whole 240 million up front, doing the whole thing.
And you'll probably see that on the, this other crazy graph again, if you can see anything. Yeah, the one short-term loan is the green that, yeah, I mean, the 240 million is off the chart. Green is closer here, and then, yeah.
I'd like to know anybody's sense of the comparable quality issues that each of these options give us in terms of the plant itself. And maybe there's no difference, I just don't know. I mean, what happens in terms of the actual results that we're getting out of the water treatment plant if we finance them in these different ways? Is there any sense of that? I mean, is there an advantage, for example, to be sort of slowly building and refurbishing because the technology is going to be changing, and that actually gives you some more flexibility, so that the 240 million bond, you know, gives you all the cash right then, but maybe you don't want all the cash right then because you build in some obsolescence into the system. I don't know, I'm just asking.
We covered that a little bit, and I could cover it in my part of the presentation, but in previous presentations, we have mentioned one potential advantage of building a treatment plant, if the council elected to do it, a brand new treatment plant. There's a potential advantage of having it built train by train, and I hope you understand when we talk about the train, we talked a little bit about what that means. But, you know, years in the future, probably well off this chart, when things had to be rehabbed in that treatment plant, if it was new, if it was built new now, they would be able to rehab it also train by train. So you're not necessarily having this huge expense, you know, another $100 million projects to rehab your plant in the future. So there is a potential benefit that some of our consultants have pointed out, you know, building it train by train. Now, I think the disadvantage in building it train by train is we're having to balance and run two treatment plants for a period of time. You've got a little bit of an increase in operating costs for probably 15 years where you run two treatment plants and you know, slowly let one treatment plant go offline while you bring additional phases in the second treatment plant up and running. There's also a balancing effort that has to go on. The state has talked about that, where, you know, we're going to have more than just for 5 years. You know, we're going to have this balance that we're going to have to work out with the state. And I think we've talked a little bit about that concern. It's not, this is not solved by 2025. It's you know, we're probably at least out into the 2033, 2034 time period before we have 3 phases of our treatment plant built, 3 trains of our treatment plant that brings us up to about 18 MGD, which is really close to where we're at with our current treatment plant. So I don't know if that helps to understand, you know, it's not an easy answer. There's not a black and white answer.
For comparative purposes, because you turn all these into pay-as-you-goes, do you have a model that shows if you just bonded at every step at these low interest rates and you stepped it up to at every phase that you add, and how that would play into the rates?
No, the only option we did was on the previous presentation, we did 2 bonds, but it was still only $80 million just split into two loans instead of one.
Then turn that into a pay-as-you-go.
Right.
Cliff, I think what I would add also, the concern that we heard early on, this has probably been more than a year ago from the council, is that continuous loan also has interest, with each of those trains being built.
Right.
And that interest is going to start to build to the point where you're paying multiple loans back, and is that?
I get it. I just thought for illustrative purposes, if you could see the comparison, do you end up higher than 90 or lower than 90? I mean, how does that play out if you do it that way?
I think, I don't know for sure, Jimmy can probably correct me, but I think it would soften the blow for rates, but eventually, because you're paying interest out, in the 2040 time period, you're gonna get to the point where your rates are high just simply because you're paying interest.
To answer a little bit of the difference between the treatment quality in the different methods. So the first 4 are essentially the same treatment quality, but they're somewhat in different stages and phases, and there's a certain amount of maybe different treatment quality in that in some of them we're keeping the existing treatment plant going for a certain amount of time while we're phasing in the new plant. The 5th one is refurbishing the existing plant, which has some inherent risk for future standards, as we talked about, because, as we try to deal with some of these future standards, with a new plant, we can do a more robust method that can handle some of these future treatment standards. Whereas with the existing plant, we're limited very much by what we can do and can't do and how much we can adjust into the new standards. So that's, to answer that part of the question, that's the quality of treatment for the different methods.
So that seems like the highest risk option for the purposes of treatment. And regulations. Yeah.
Well, talking about kind of the different options and weighing the different options, I like the idea of building in phases because we can take advantage of technological improvements as the later phases come on. The flip side of that might be if we took out a larger loan at the beginning and built more capacity, we could theoretically trade some of those credits to surrounding communities, and they could be helping us pay for the infrastructure investment up front. And so that's just another wrinkle to consider.
And that's the sooner we can convert the existing plant into something else, right?
Right.
One of the other factors in Jimmy's presentation here, and I'm going to try to get him to back on track here, because one of the other impacts is inflation, construction increase, in the future. And he'll show you an example we've talked internally just a little bit about. And inflation could potentially make a huge difference in later phases. So the pay-as-you-go option does have some risk to it in increased construction costs. It doesn't take a lot of inflation. You'll see a lot of inflation to make a substantial difference.
Also, real quick, another factor to consider as far as risk goes is the longer we continue to operate our existing plant as we're building new phases, it increases risk because it's aging, and the risk of failure continues to go up the longer that gets pulled on.
Yeah, so with Dave's point, we have a few options that we wanted to make sure were talked about that are not in any of our models right now, but they do impact the overall financial picture. One is the population growth. We bring that up because we're talking about providing infrastructure on the west side that can accommodate growth, but we don't have factored in growth in our customer base, those paying rates. It's a little bit less of a concern to me. It might end up decreasing the cost of or amount of the rate increases, but from our perspective, it's likely similar for all of the options. So it would keep the scale the same. It might impact some of the numbers as far as the revenue that we're getting back from new residents of Provo. A bigger impact would be inflation, and I'll after I go through the others, I'll bring up a spreadsheet to show an example of that. Another example is expended operating costs. Depending on the phasing that we choose, if phasing is chosen, it could result in operating 2 treatment plants at the same time. And we've factored in some operating cost increases, but depending on how long we run an existing plant, could impact the operating cost there. Compared to with inflation, that's probably a lot lower concern. We're probably talking hundreds of thousands a year or less, compared with millions. So another example is conservation. People using less water, having to treat less water. Again, that's potentially a smaller on the scale, especially compared with this last one, resource recovery, where we potentially have the opportunity for revenue streams associated with algae or biogas or water reuse, any number of those type of situations where these aren't all created equal, I guess is my point. But we do want to make sure the council is aware of these impacts to the funding. So I wanted to go show an example of the potential impact of inflation. This is the same lovely graph you've been seeing that shows with zero inflation how the fund balance works. And you'll see as I'm going to change the annual inflation number here at the bottom, and it's going to apply that inflation to our future construction costs as we have them planned out. And so since the $240 million bond is all up front, it has quite a bit different impact as some of these that have capital investment way out in the future. So one example is just 1%. It shows they all drop because we're not increasing the rates to cover that inflation. But this purple $240 million bond, it takes a while. It gets out into 2040 before it's has the lowest drop in fund balance. But because of that we're locking in the cost up front over time. That ends up being less expensive essentially. So in 1%, 2%, the higher we go on inflation, obviously the higher that widens. So we wanted to make sure you had an idea of the range of the potential scope of that assumption. What resource recovery is another example that could have a major impact on our revenue and on our ability to pay back debt or bonds, or even pay as we go on future portions of a project. But
question. So the last 10 years we've had low inflation, but if you look back over 50 or 100 years, what's the average yearly inflation? 4%. 4%. So you can put that 4% in there.
Yeah, we're down here 184 million versus this next group at 350 million.
So in this model, you would conclude that you're better off to get the 240 up front and build the thing. And
yeah, so in this case, if we were to go back and apply, adjust the rate increases in each of the options to get these all back up to zero, then it would show a lot different picture on that $240 million option. They would all be much higher, but
I think it's useful to point out that the risk is really if construction cost inflation outpaces normal inflation. Because if you're looking at it in terms of real dollar values, if that inflation is general, then the nominal or the dollar amount might change, but the purchasing power won't. so they'll go up in parity. So the risk is that construction costs will outpace that normal inflationary cost. So it's, I think, not as much of a risk. That 4% is general inflation. So the amounts that we'll have to raise the rates will go up. Effectively, the rate percentage, the purchasing power rate increase won't change significantly related to that.
And that's exactly why we started at 1 or 2%, because the question really becomes to make this a fair comparison, a good comparison for the council to understand. Has construction cost outpaced inflation? And I would say in the last 5 years, yes, definitely it has. It's probably more in tune with 1 or 2%. And will that continue? And obviously we don't know the answers to that in the future, but if the last 5 years is an indication of the next 5 years, I would say yes, it's going to.
But if we're borrowing money in $20 and we lock that in with a low interest rate and we're paying it back with $40, seems like it's not just the difference between construction inflation and regular inflation. It seems like by locking it in now at a interest rate lower than even regular inflation, that we're getting savings over the life as well.
That is correct. There is less interest rate risk, assuming we're in a low interest rate environment. So that is.
But can you assume with a general inflation rate that is a general inflation rate averaged in terms of okay, how do I want to ask this question? So are there certain incomes, certain professions that typically do not keep up with I think I know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Don't keep up with inflation, so people are going to be poorer. Yeah, so you're going to have some
into those types of issues, and I think that's a question for the council to answer.
Oh, thanks. Sorry.
This isn't the case, so we're never going to see interest rates like we have today. I mean, historically, this is the lowest it's ever been, so for it to go down, it's not going to be very likely. For it to go up, I paid 15% on my home loan. I borrowed the first one. So historically, interest rates are going to go up, so we should assume that they're going to go up. Look at what we borrow based on that, because that's going to happen. Happen already.
I mean, a year ago, we were at 40-year lows. It's up now. I know, but a year ago.
It's went down. Mortgage rates went down.
Did it?
Yeah. So I mean, we're not on a
Well, right now, but long term, we can't go much lower.
Especially with the amount of debt that the country's taking on.
Yeah.
Gonna have to go up.
So I have a question in comparing the phased approach to the all upfront approach. I like the idea of the possibility of different trains using newer technology over time, but it seems like there would be a potential drawback there, compatibility issues, trying to operate different trains with different technologies. So what I'm wondering is, have we seen, maybe our state people can answer this, have you seen in Utah or in other states examples of this phased approach where it was successfully able to incorporate better technology with each phase and be able to get it all work together?
Yeah, we've seen a number of facilities. Some of the facilities in Salt Lake County they have different trains, and they've been utilizing those trains to do process experimentation, basically, since the Phosphorus Rule came into place. And so what we've seen from a lot of those facilities in their variance requests is they've decided on a process train, and they're now converting all of their trains to that process. And so that's been an approach that a number of people have taken, as well as a number of those plants were built with the capacity for growth. And as they grew, they built that new processing. And so they were experimenting with that new train during the time period, and now that the regulation is kind of in place, they say, okay, we're gonna convert 4 more basins to this process or something along those lines, which would very much mirror what you guys have talked about doing.
So what's more important to me than building them sequentially or all at once is the fact that we do build them in separate trains, that we divide it out so that you could take one offline and retrofit it, and you have options.
Under the current options that you're seeing, that would, even if we took out the $240 million loan, they would still be built in trains, 4 separate trains.
One of the other things we wanted to show, this was in our last presentation, but it was toward the end and we wanted to make sure we had a little bit more time to talk about it. This is just our current comparison with other cities. You know, as we saw on the previous chart, we're getting up into the $90, sometimes $100 range, which would, you know, in the current environment, outpace all the other cities. But we were able to find one example of on Salt Lake City's website where they talk about their new implementation. I guess I should go back and show Salt Lake. They're in the $52 or so range. On their website, they're talking about over the next several years, because of their new treatment plant they're building on the existing site, they're likely going to be doubling by 2021. So they're going to be up in the $100 range. And so, you know, that's just to keep in mind that, you know, these regulations are going to be impacting all the communities along the Wasatch Front, not just Provo. So even though today we're here lower and we'll be jumping to the top of this with no other changes to any other cities, that's very unlikely that'll happen. So that's the financial portion of the presentation. I'll give the time to Dave.
Thank you, Shimmy. It's working. That's great. We have just 3 slides left, and I'm going to probably create more questions than answers with 3 slides. But I do want to talk a little bit about the next steps. Some of them have already been talked about. And I think Rebecca is handing out a copy of the variance letter. I hope we're not crossing up the state by handing this out. I think it sounded like it was
probably on our website.
Pretty close to getting on the website anyway. So we wanted to give the council a copy of the state's response. I think it's classified probably as a draft approval of the variance request that the council passed a resolution on some time ago. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the dates. Erica did cover some of the dates in it, and if there's any questions, we're happy to talk a little bit more about the dates. But the first important date, and I'm actually on page 3 of the variance letter right at the top. It's item number C, June 1st of this year, 2018. The city council would need to pass a resolution adopting one of 3 different standards. And I think it's important to note here. I've tried to emphasize in some of the past presentations, and I'll say it again. The city does have an option to go back and just make a decision and say, hey, we're just going to do chemical treatment at the existing plant. And it's not an option that we've spent a lot of time on. It's not one that I would recommend. But I think in order to get all the data, all the information to the council that is necessary for a decision to be made, I think it's important for that point to be made. The city does have that option. There are some drawbacks with it. Again, it's probably not a recommended step, but I think it's important to note that is an option still. And it would require the city, and again, I look to Erica and her staff to step in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but it would require the city to take an immediate action so that we could have the chemical treatment up and running by January of 2020. We would be required to meet the regulation immediately by 2020 at our existing facility. Is that correct?
That's
So-
why we built this timeline, so that if you did go that direction, it's time for you to do it.
And that same timeline is important to Corey Christiansen, who's sitting in the back, our consultant, because it's going to take him some time as well to get plans, construction projects, things rolling to meet that deadline. That's not a deadline that, hey, projects can, in 2020, we can still be building. That project has to be done, all of the required projects. So there's a timeline built in here, not just for state purposes, for construction, design, planning purposes. And we've been talking in the late April, May timeframe, and that really was the deadline that we got from Corey and his group. So but I just want to make sure that the council understands that particular deadline. And then there's two other deadlines that Erica covered, one in May of 2019 and then December of 2019. One thing that I would differentiate some of those deadlines, and I believe it was Council Member Handley that asked a question about choosing a specific technology. The June deadline does not necessarily require us to pick a specific technology. It's just going a certain direction. We're making a decision about, are we going to do chemical, or are we going to build a new treatment plant, or are we going to rehab our existing treatment plant? But we're not necessarily choosing a specific technology in June. And that's the difference. We're choosing a technology potentially later. However, if we want to take advantage of some of the potential sustainability issues, water reuse, or exchanging credits with other cities, potentially that go into Utah Lake, and particularly relative to the financial application that we've spent so much time, the sooner we can make a decision and get direction from the administration and the council on the specific technology, the better off we are. So not waiting until that decision is made. And I'll answer, I think Councilmember Stewart asked a little bit of a question, maybe more of a statement about, have we chosen a technology? And I shook my head no to that question, and I'll tell you the reason why. I think we are leaning, strongly leaning to, they call it an MBR, membrane bioreactor plant. Is that correct, Corey? And the reason that we're doing that, and I think I speak for the staff, it's a state of the art technology. It's dealing with regulations that have been talked about. We're trying to get the city as far ahead as we can because of what we're seeing on the horizon. So to answer the question, yes, we're certainly leaning to a certain technology. There are other technologies though, and I'm going to skip a little bit down to this bullet point right here. There are some emerging technologies that we potentially could take advantage of in combination with that type of a plant that we're already decision that we've already leaning toward. We're already kind of going that direction, and the issue, that particular issue kind of merges, these two issues kind of merge together, because we look at those potential, some of them, not all of them, but some of the emerging technologies potentially help us with sustainability issues. So my understanding of the ClearAss product potentially generates a revenue benefit for South Davis. So they're actually harvesting, they're actually intentionally growing algae basically in a controlled environment, harvesting it, and then the company, the private company has, and this is where the private partnership also comes in. They have an agreement with that private company to go out and market the algae. And depending on what they get through that private company, South Davis will have a financial benefit. So in that particular case, the private partnership is a fairly, I don't know how to particularly explain this, but South Davis hasn't at least my understanding, they have not sold off, they haven't given up any control of their treatment plant. It's still their complete responsibility, their operation. They've just basically entered into an agreement with a private company to go out and market the algae. And that's where the benefit comes back to South Davis. So that's a technology that we feel like we need to look into.
So does their rate of return or rate increases depend partially on that company performing? Because as we've seen with Utopia,
yes,
those companies don't often make it. They're in the leading edge. So if it's extra and not beyond what you would expect, and I had some real problems with that.
So that's one of the risks in a private partnership like South Davis has done. And again, I'm kind of skipping. I apologize. I've skipped through these, probably not the way I intended to take them. But there are certain things that we have not explored significantly or sufficiently for me to come back to the council and make a recommendation. And clearly, emerging technologies is one of them. I have to tell you, I get at least 1 or 2 calls or emails a week from different companies talking about, we're going to save the world with wastewater treatment. And I know the administration, I get a lot of emails from the administration. And I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to pursue every single one of them. There's just too many out there. But if we start to see something that another treatment plant that's local, like the Clear House project, or there's a clear-cut reason for us to pursue at least an initial investigation, it would be something that we would look into. Please.
So, depending on the technology that we choose, will the location limit the technologies that are possible? For example, rehabbing our old facility, maybe limits what technologies you could end up using there.
Yeah, that's correct. Let me back up and try to go through this the way I intended, because I think it'll make a little bit more sense. When I say next steps, I'm skipping some of the steps that I feel like the city needs to take. So we talked a little bit about the variance letter and some of the critical dates, and a decision about a new treatment plant versus rehab. We've talked, I think, sufficiently there. The council has asked, or some of the council members may be interested in touring our current facility. I know some of you have toured the facility, some of you have probably not. And Mark and his staff would be, I'd like to make sure that offer is out on the table for any of the council members or staff for that matter, anybody that wants to come and tour the plant. I think it would be good. I think it's, and I told Mark, I don't want the public tour. I want the back room tour here. I need the council to understand exactly where we're at with the treatment plant and the age of the treatment plant. So I've asked Mark to do that. We talked a little bit about emerging technologies, and as I indicated, I'm a little concerned about trying to pursue or have our staff pursue every single one of the emerging technologies. Let me back up here for just a second and talk about a siting study. This is an important decision. This is an important item that we need to make sure that the council understands. Once a decision's made about a new treatment plant, and if the council elects to pursue a new treatment plant, we would immediately start with a group of consultants and looking at a siting study. And out of the siting study, I would not only ask the consultants to come back and make a recommendation for specific sites, but also use of technology at those sites. So as you've alluded, some of those sites may limit our ability to use specific technology or reuse of some resource that comes out of the treatment plant. So that siting study, I feel like, is one of the most important steps in this list right now. And again, the sooner that we can have a decision about the direction from the administration the council wants to take, it helps us to start that process a little bit sooner. We would be looking at several of these other categories. Water reuse is one that we've already started to have a conversation with certain agencies, state agencies, and other local agencies. And those sustainability issues could potentially change the financial forecast, hopefully in the positive. We've tried to lay out what I would classify as maybe the worst case scenario. We have not considered, we've told the council, we have not considered impact fees in any of the calculations on rates. Impact fees could potentially make a difference, probably not a significant one. Impact fees, as you know, are under review right now. But it could make a potential difference in the rates that the customers see. But right now, we have not considered impact fees. We have not considered any other revenue potential that would come from a treatment plant. So I think we've tried to again, kind of paint the worst case scenario here. It's always easier to go the other direction. The last item, unless there's any other questions on those items, the last item I just wanted to give a quick update on wastewater metering. We talked about this in the last presentation. There's 32 sites that we're monitoring. We continue to do that. I'm still not to the point, I don't think any of our staff members are to the point where we feel like we have enough data to make some clear conclusions on development, particularly on the west side, but actually in several parts of the city. So we're doing this again, just to reiterate, we're trying to look at I&I issues, inflow and infiltration issues in the collection system, so that it helps us to understand potential development issues, again, particularly on the west side. So that process is still underway, not yet making any recommendations. I did also want to show this graph. This graph had been prepared by Rebecca, shown with just the minimum flows on it in the last presentation. She went back and made, I think there was a question, I think Councilmember Harding asked about some other data being added to this chart, and we did it. You can see it pretty much mirrors itself throughout the years. A little bit of an uptick in some of these areas, but again, we're not ready to make any conclusions at this point. So I think that's, unless there's any questions, and I'm hoping that there are some questions. We're done with the presentation part.
Rich,
please.
Let's see if I can phrase this right. Which of the financing options eliminates rate increases due to inflation of interest rates? Is a $50 million bond plus natural increase in rates give us enough to do the job and not have to do a second bond? Which one doesn't require us to do a second bond?
If I'm answering if I'm understanding your question correctly, in fact, I think in Jimmy's presentation, I think we've eliminated all options that require a second bond. But we're not showing a second bond in any of the options. Now, it does make a difference in the rate increases, though.
So interest rates are going to be a factor in the future, whatever one we decide on.
That's correct.
You know, there's the bonding plus the fact of the rate increases is going to cover what you need to have.
That's correct. So the difference, the point that we were trying to make with today's presentation is construction costs and inflation may make a difference in rates in the future, but we are not making any assumption for second bonds in any of the options that we're presenting. No second loans. They're either short-term, and they vary from a 5-year payback to a 20-year payback, or one large bond for $240 million, and you just build the whole plant.
I'm curious. I don't feel like I've heard any persuasive argument about doing the refurbishing of the existing plant. I mean, is that a serious proposal still? It just doesn't. Maybe I don't mean to be speaking for other council members, but I don't see that as a viable option at this point. And if that's part of what you're feeling would be better to know sooner than later, what would we need to do to at least make that decision? Yeah, I mean, can we take it off the table? Do we need? I haven't had the tour, so I'm one of the people who hasn't seen the existing plant, which I'm happy to do very soon. But even so, it doesn't sound like I'm going to see anything there that I don't already. I mean, I'm sure I'd benefit from seeing it, but I don't feel like it's going to be the deal breaker one way or the other on that particular question.
I agree with George. It would be nice to take that off the table so we can just eliminate taking time and effort to study it.
Let me tell you a little bit of the history, remind everybody about the history of why that option was put on the table initially. And it came a lot from the work from Corey Christiansen, our consultant that's looking at the master plan. And he indicated rehabbing the existing treatment plant initially is the lower option. It will cost less for the next 20 years, I think. It doesn't cross until 2040. Am I right, Corey?
Close to that, yes.
So we're talking about 20 plus years into the future where the cost of rehabbing the existing treatment plant actually is less than building a brand new treatment plant. Whether you phase it or whether you build a whole brand new treatment plant in one package, it's going to cost the city less money. But eventually, the operation cost of running a plant that will be nearly 100 years old in 2040. It will be 90, 85 years old, Mark, am I right? In 40. 85-year-old treatment plant that you've rehabbed it. I mean, it's not, everything's not old, but a lot of the infrastructure in the ground underneath it is going to be old. Even when you rehab a plant, you're not going to ever be able to replace everything in the plant. So there are certain parts of it that you're going to be relying on an 85-year-old piece of equipment, a pipe, something in there. And there is a risk. And that's the reason I think that you hear less of the argument. And also, as we try to anticipate new technologies, we try to anticipate new regulations, getting an older treatment plant to meet those new regulations probably will be harder as it goes along.
David, one thing you didn't add to that, though, is that it doesn't include the cost of catastrophic failure. So the crossing in 2040 was if everything works well, and which is
That's correct.
Too big a risk. I thought in past presentations we heard.
That's correct.
And I thought in 2025, the trickle system has got to go anyway by 2025.
It is. There is.
And could we even get regulations after 2025 with this place that we've got? So you say 40 years.
The trickling filters that you see at the existing treatment plant, they've never been rehabilitated. They've never had any work done to them. So they are original with the treatment plant. And Mark is actually in the process of taking, I think, both of them offline. I think we've got one of them offline. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have one.
So we're already kind of getting to the point where, the reality of our treatment plant is kind of hitting us right up front and saying, hey, you don't want the trickling filters to take themselves down. I don't want to have an emergency situation where the trickling filter is no longer working and we have to decide, today how that's going to operate. And so Mark, I think in conjunction with Corey, has said, hey, we need to do this in a well-organized, knowing manner. And so we've actually started the process of taking those trickling filters off. And what does it mean to take them offline, to Mark, so that we know kind of going into it, this is a managed approach instead of an emergency. And so our plant, again, already the age of our plant is kind of hitting us immediately. Corey, I don't know if you want to add anything as far as the option on rehabbing our plant, a little more perspective.
So just to clarify what Dave is saying is that right now you have so much capacity in your treatment plant. And in order to make the adjustments that we need to make to meet the short-term regulatory limits, the cost is less than building a new plant. And so we still have to do work at the existing plant. We need to add another aeration basin. You need to add more clarifiers and such. But that's a little bit less cost in the next, say, 15, 20 years than building a new plant is going to be. But you are going to have to do some construction there. And what Mr. Stewart said is exactly correct, though, is when we did the condition assessment on your facility, we identified a number of pieces of your plant that are, according to the calculations that we do in the system that we use, are, say, 15, 20 years beyond their useful life.
And that doesn't mean that they are gonna fail 15 years ago, that just means that there's a high risk of failure now. And so that's the part that makes the existing plant less favorable, is just that we're incurring this risk the longer we run this old infrastructure. And some of it is difficult to get to, like concrete pipes that are under the ground that have to have water in them to run your plant, so it's hard for us to see them. But if you have a 50-year-old concrete pipe in the ground that has been carrying wastewater for 50 years, the chances are failure of that is high. And so that's really what Dave's saying, and that's why that existing facility upgrade hasn't been preferred by your staff, is that high risk, and yes, in the short term, the next 15, 20 years, you're gonna spend less money, but out to 2040, at some point, when you start to replace some of this infrastructure that's reached it's reached the end of its useful life, that cost exceeds, and at the end of the day, the cheapest option overall, as far as the amount of money you are spending on construction, is to build a brand new plant, the big one, all at once, because that's just the cheapest way to do it. But that one hits you the hardest early. And so when we first did the project, we were trying to minimize the impact to your ratepayers as best we could. And if we just made a decision based on that, you might choose the existing plant. But when you factor in all the other things like newer technology, resource recovery, and the high risk of a catastrophic failure, then that option, you may be protecting the ratepayers in the short term on paper, but you're not accounting for that big risk you're asking the ratepayers to make.
Yeah, persuaded me even more that that's it.
What's that?
That's
not a good
I'm
option.
even more persuaded that this is just a bad option. It sounds irresponsible to me. It sounds very risky. I mean, I understand the financial issue, but it just seems very risky.
And we're happy to share. It's a pretty comprehensive way we do the process we go through doing a condition assessment. Mark and actually Dave, back when we did that, spent several days working through that process, and it takes into account inspections and operating history and maintenance costs and maintenance. And so it's the most scientific way we have of predicting that risk and identifying that risk and putting a number to it. And I can't tell you if it's going to actually fail, but I can tell you there's a high risk of failure, and that's really the best that I can offer you on that.
You want a motion to take it off the table? Would that help? I think we're probably ready to vote on that one.
I'm not sure that it helps us. I mean, we won't spend. We're not spending on some of these. We're not spending a lot of time. We're trying to keep the options open so that the council hears. We're looking at all the options, just saying, hey, we want to make sure the council hears all the data.
David, is so confusing anyway. Take options off the table that really aren't realistic would be helpful for me, at least, in the council.
I think though that when you go to tell the story about why the rate increases to cover this, the question will come up every time, why not just redo it? And if you've got those available, then you simply just say, well, this is what happens if we do this, and this is why it's a bad idea.
That's where we are.
Yeah.
Please.
So, again, the location, if we stay at the current location and try to keep it running and upgrade it, there's only so much we can do. Doesn't that limit the future technologies that we can use at that location, or is anything still possible there?
There's some evaluation that has happened from a staff level as far as emerging technologies. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable at this point to say we've eliminated or we've come to any conclusions as far as emerging technologies at the existing site. It's part of the reason that I'm feeling like we need to do that siting study so that we can have an outside group of eyes looking at it and saying, what about, can we use the ClearAs project? Can you grow algae? Where would you do that on the existing site? Is water reuse an option at the existing site, and where? And some of the details, energy efficiency. Some of those sites may come out and say, hey, you can't, don't plan on growing algae in this particular location. And I'm not sure that we're that far along yet to eliminate the existing site. I do have to tell you, and again, I'm kind of looking at the existing site and saying, you know, we've got room next to the existing treatment plant to build a brand new treatment plant. It still would rely in some of the piping that the existing treatment plant utilizes, and would have to figure out, do we have to pipe around some of that piping? That's detail that we haven't gotten into yet with our consultants. But it's important to understand, you know, the council needs to know we have not selected a specific site. If they choose a new treatment plant, if the choice is a new treatment plant, we have not selected the site yet. There's some obvious ones. You know, there's two pretty obvious choices here, but I don't want anybody to think that we've selected the site.
So have you considered, if we do a gravity system, that we don't have the cost and the maintenance of a lot of the pumping stations anymore?
Right. So in a siting study, that's one of the advantages. If it was moved onto the west side, that's one of the advantages that would come out in a siting study, and they'd say you're going to save, you know, a certain amount of money from an energy cost perspective because you're using gravity more. It's important to know that the existing treatment plant and potential sites out west, they don't differ really that much from an elevation standpoint. You'd be surprised. Mark probably has a little bit better perspective here, but I think it's less than 20 feet that we're talking about vertical change. Am I right here, Shane? What's that?
They're almost even.
I was just looking at the lake level. I mean,
We're right about
Water's pretty good
4,500
indicator.
in elevation for both sides. We're just a little bit higher at the existing treatment plant.
There is, you know, there's 62, 63 years of infrastructure that all pipes flow to that area. So there would still need to be a lift station or a pump station at the existing plant to get it to the west side. There are some areas where they can alter the flow and make some connections and divert it that way. But for years, everything has came to that central location. And you're not going to change that without that station or pump station.
We actually have looked at a trunk line that does take it from the treatment plant to the west without a lift station.
And you have the cost of that line.
But it does.
Are those
have to
costs
cross I-15.
are they reflected in the projected
It's not gonna
costs?
be cheap.
No, they are not. So again, a siting study is going to help us to understand, you know, if we move the location again to the west side, they're going to identify a potential for, you know, some pipes that aren't shown right now. And there'll be large projects. And there's going to be some savings. There's going to be some energy savings. And again, we're using gravity. But I'm not to the conclusion where we're going to say, hey, this is an absolute yes on this particular site, because it may not pan out, you know, exactly the way, you know, we're thinking about it, or the way the staff is, you know, necessarily. So that's why I'm thinking it's good to have an outside, you know, third party, and it would be a group of consultants. It would not just be one consultant. It would be a group of consultants to consider, you know, the hydrology, various sustainability issues that we've talked about. You know, they would be looking at a number of issues here. We want to make a good choice of the location, not just about the technology, but the location is going to be very important.
Timing, Dave. This is feeling like we're getting under the gun here. I look at a January 1st deadline, a June 1st deadline, and how are we dealing with the issues like that?
It is, and that's kind of why we're not intentionally putting the heat on, but I think you know, we're starting to feel like, hey, we've got to make a decision here, and I think that's partly why we spent the last 6 months or a year with the council coming back fairly regularly, coming back and talking about this issue and saying, here's where the staff is, here's where our consultants are guiding us and giving recommendations, here's what we're feeling like, and we're getting really close here where we need some decisions made.
I think that's what George is trying to do.
I'm going to make the motion, Gary.
Hey.
I'm going to make the motion that we endorse building a new treatment plant and a site yet to be determined, and not consider rehabbing the old plant.
Does that include leaving the phased option on the table as well?
Well, any option still on the table for finance.
Except for that. Second motion.
Any discussion?
Yeah.
So as far as the siting study, would you have an answer for us by June 1st?
I have a really bad reputation of pushing consultants really hard and our staff. And I've already, the group of consultants we've already talked with and said, this is going to happen very quickly. We're going to need to know recommendations, even if they're in draft form, we're going to need some recommendations very quickly.
And the siting study would give us more definitive information as to whether it was in any way desirable to stay where we are.
Yep, it's going to look at not just the site, again, not site locations, but we're going to ask them to look at emerging technologies, come back with recommendations on any technology that we ought to be considering, any sustainability, energy issues, water reuse, anything like that, and specifically look at the sites and say, is there an advantage at individual sites in these different categories? And they need to come back with some recommendations. And we need to see this quickly.
David, my motion doesn't have anything to do with siting, it's just still be cited in the old plan. So with siting to be determined.
Restate your motion.
To endorse building a new treatment plant at a site which was yet to be determined and to not endorse rehabilitating the old.
So we can still build a new one next to the old one.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Wayne, do you have any input?
I think we're supportive of that direction. It's been pretty clear as the process has developed, that's the right answer. In terms of timing, so June 1st is coming up. We have about 4 meetings between then. When do you anticipate being back on the agenda?
So if we had that direction, that clear of a direction, I would get it scheduled, maybe not at the next, but the following city council. Yep.
24th.
I have a question, but I think we can vote and then ask the question. Like,
Okay.
all
right. Any other discussion? If not, we'll call for a vote. Those in favor? That's unanimous.
Not a question, thank you. So June 1st deadline said one of the proposed alternatives, but it doesn't mention site. So can we make a decision on whether we do a new facility phased implementation or a new facility full capacity without a site decision?
Yes.
So the site decision doesn't have to be, I mean, we can go forward on the implementation without that.
So if I understand correctly from the state's deadlines, we, on June 1st, we are not required to identify the technology or the site that we're using. It's just a direction, one of those 3 directions that they're asking in the study. It's not until, what is it? It's actually not until December 1st of 2019, if I'm reading right, that they say, we need to know exactly what your plan is, your location, and your technology. Is that correct?
That's correct. And really the intent of the June 1st deadline is to push the city to make a decision. You guys have done a very good job in your due diligence in looking at options. You've presented us with a variance request with 3 high-level options, which are presented in the variance request as these 3. And so we're asking you to make that high-level decision soon so that you can make progress against your milestones. So that we have confidence that you're going to get there.
And I would add one other comment. I would prefer, if we have clear direction from the council, I would prefer to have a decision as far as the site as soon as we can get information back from the siting study. I would rather not wait until December of 2019. I'd rather go through the study, present the information to the council, and have a decision relatively quickly after that recommendation is given to the council.
So when Dr. Gaddis was here talking about the possible financing, when do we indicate that how much we want and move to secure that? Where does that fall in the phase between now and 2019?
So the reason I asked the question about approaching the state before having some of these final decisions as far as technology and site location I would, if the council is inclined to approach the state, I would prefer to start the process and be able to have paperwork or whatever the preliminary information is for the state, and to be able to maybe even work with state officials. I'm not quite sure how that will work, but have preliminary process going so that when we make a decision, when we get the siting study back, we get the recommendations from the consultants and bring that back to the council. We've done the preliminary information already with the state, and we're not having to start from, you know, the very beginning with the state. So if the council, one of the main questions that I had for the council is if they're inclined to go through the state for a loan the way we're talking, should we start that now? Do we begin that process now?
My only concern is the balance on the cost of materials, having to use those, and if we could get some direction on that, I can't see why we wouldn't go up to the state.
I agree with Gary. That's exactly what I need to know. Tell us what we should do.
Well, we can start. So if that's the focus, this helps because it starts to focus our staff efforts, you know, very specifically, and we can have Jimmy and some of our consultants starting to focus on what does it mean, you know, Buy America. What does Davis-Bacon mean as far as you know, contracts and procurement, and we can start to focus the conversation a little bit more.
Just rough numbers based on the 20-year loan, to go from 3% down to 0.75%. Obviously, these numbers are just kind of picked out of the air, but to go from 3 down to 0.75, that's equivalent to a 23.5% increase in the overall project costs. So if it costs 23.5% extra to go from 3 to 0.75, that's where your break-even point is. So if we're talking 10% or whatever increase, then it's significant.
I'll make the second motion to investigate looking at the state for funding for a project based on information that the staff and consultants will give us.
Do we need that motion? I'm glad to do that.
I'll second.
Okay. Is that what you want, Dave? Is that the direction you're looking for?
I would probably recommend that we at least initiate the process with the state. We start looking into it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on that? Okay, we'll call for a vote. Those in favor? That's unanimous. Yeah. Okay.
One more question. If we have 4 meetings before June 1st, is that 5? 4?
About 4, unless we had 1.
So we have this decision to make whether we phase or whether we go full bore. How do we, what other presentations do we need as council, or what other information do we need to make that decision? I'm not quite sure what I need, but I don't know what the possibilities with that.
And let me tell you the schedule. Right now, you have meetings on April 10th and 25th. We have a potential, we're kind of holding a meeting for the 17th of April, just in case you decide you want one. In May, your meetings are on the 1st and the 15th. And worst case scenario, you could put another first.
And the 15th.
First, 15th, I think 15th is just a work meeting though. And then the 22nd.
No, the 22nd is the
Budget
budget
retreat.
The 15th is the
Oh,
working
okay.
council meetings.
Right. So if you wanted to give some kind of formal thing at a regular council meeting, we could always schedule on the 29th or even the 22nd at night if we wanted to.
I think the things that we need for the decision has to do with options of finances, and I mean, those are the, is that what you're looking for, Kay? Is that?
I don't know if we just need the presentation that they've given us, they understand it better or comprehend it better or work through the scenarios a little more, or if there's other information we need.
I have the same question in my mind. I can't figure out what questions to ask to get to a clearer understanding, but maybe part of it is, I mean, I don't feel ready to decide that now, in part because maybe I just need, you know, a couple of weeks to think about it and then come back, and even just hearing some of the same information again, but digging in a little more deeply, I feel like to have some time to assimilate it and think about I don't know, even as you were presenting, I thought of a lot more questions in my head this time around than I did the first time, because the first time was even more drinking from a fire hose than this time was. So maybe I'm just a little slow here, but I feel like another presentation with maybe some more thought, now that we're sort of moving the refurbishing thing off the table altogether. At least that's one line on the graph that I don't have to be looking at.
Yeah, maybe like take those graphs, break them down a little bit. Like, okay, this one has an impact on our citizens slower. This one's faster. Maybe look at that a little closer and really what is the impact and
some pros and cons.
Yeah, just detail it a little bit.
And I need an analog. You could give us, if you give us analog presentation that we can read and study, not just have to watch you presenting. I can make a decision.
Would you like to see? I agree. I felt like if I could look at this in between meetings, even.
With Wayne's suggestions, having some pros and cons and what it means.
Would you like to see hard numbers as opposed to just graphs too? Because we see graphs and you're not sure where on that.
I don't like graphs.
You want to say that one?
We'll take both.
Well, graphs that are that complex are.
If I can add one comment to the question, and it's helpful to hear from the council members, and I'd be happy to have, you know, emails either through Cliff or, you know, through the administration come to Public Works, because if there are things that individual council members would like to help, you know, kind of guide a decision, it helps me to know what do we need to ask the consultants for, what do we need to get from the staff. Let me give you one example, though, in responding to that question about making a decision. Given the direction that we've heard today, I would go back to the group of consultants that are looking at the siting study, and we're going to start that immediately, because the reason that one of the issues that will come out of the siting study is they'll look at sustainability issues, and they'll start to be able to merge some of these issues together and say, do we get any benefit from going to a particular site or a particular technology, which helps to kind of guide the council to say, hey, this is an area where you might get some resource recovery. Exactly. And it helps to kind of steer the council, instead of just saying, hey, let's just do the, you know, traditional treatment methods. And that would be my recommendation, is to, and again, our consultants are gonna shoot me. But
that's really reassuring, actually, because if you're asking me how much do you want to spend on a new car, and you're not telling me what car I'm going to buy, and you're just asking me what I can afford, I mean, I can look at the abstract numbers and I can calculate what's going to cost. It's going to cost me over a certain number of years and what I'm going to be paying every month. But that's not going to tell me whether or not I made the right decision.
You disappoint a lot of car salesmen, don't you?
Okay. I was just going to make a comment.
If the difference is, well, you know, you're going to get a car that's going to last longer and it's going to be safer, but it's going to cost you a little bit more, you know, that helps me understand why I might want to spend a little bit more money. Or conversely, you know, if you're going to spend a little bit more money and you're going to get nothing of benefit out of this, then okay, I also just learned something.
And that's why I made the comment about the siting study, because if we could get something even, you know, late April, May, and I think the consultants are going to tell us probably May before they can get even a draft to us. But I think the consultants could steer, you know, and help make some of the decisions. I'm not necessarily saying, hey, we're just going to buy into whatever the consultants say, but I think I think it's important for the council to know we've started some conversations along this line already, and I think we need to have a little bit more maturity happen in some of those conversations and kind of decide, hey, are we going to get a financial benefit in making a specific decision here?
David, I appreciate you giving us all these options, but I would like to know what your financial people, the city financial people, Wayne and the administration feel like is the best option. I mean, it's unfair to ask us individually to try to come up with those decisions without having all the information you're going to be getting. So I have a lot of faith in the process that you will go through to at least tell us what you think would be the best.
I hope the council understands. We've tried to keep the options open from a transparency perspective, in helping people to understand that we're not going to close too quickly on a specific decision. So I think we've been clear, we've made recommendations, but not necessarily taken options off the table. And it's mostly an effort to be transparent.
Please take some options off the table.
That's fine. We got that message clear today, so thank you.
Well, Dave, I wanted to add to that, and my comment was going to be similar to what George just said, but I don't really have a good feel for what your staff's recommended option is at this point. So I would appreciate, like he said, your recommendation and kind of a sense of, is this a pretty good, more of a consensus recommendation that your majority of your staff and consultants feel good about it, or are you kind of split on it, and the pros and cons and why you're recommending one versus the other?
That's helpful.
Would council like to see a kind of the backup? What's the second option, the second preferred option as well?
Kind of rank them?
Yeah.
Generally, when you do a siting study, that's how they'll come with each potential site, and they'll have pros and cons, and they'll rank them based on a recommendation. So you'll see all the sites that they consider. Please.
So when you get back to the chart, starts at 2018 and shows what the utilities jump to. I would like to see the chart go back at least 2 or 3 years to when we started on this rate increase that people have already screamed about. I don't know if we've doubled it in the last 3 years, but some people feel we have. We've upped our base. Yeah, so.
We can do that. In fact, I think Jimmy probably can tell you right off the top of his head where we were at 5 years ago.
Yeah, so if we basically already doubled it recently, and then we're looking at doubling it again, I'm looking at the impact on the average utility customer and how we can draw it out so it's more palatable and more affordable for them. And then I'm also interested in loaning what we can at the best possible rates and building what we can before either rates go up on interest because prime rate goes up or other factors. We're in a place right now where we're not sure really what the future holds, and we got to take advantage of the things that, like the low interest rates.
I have one other question also, environmental impact studies. I look at what it takes to get an environmental impact study to move a park. What's the deal with the sewer plant? Is that part of the site understanding?
It is.
And the lake and the liquefaction that we hear about, all those things would be involved in that, and they can get that done fairly quickly.
They're not going to get through any of the environmental issues. They're going to come back and say, based on the different locations, here's the issues that you will have to address, and here's potential benefits at different locations and the potential negative issues. They're not going to get through, even just the permitting that was talked about today. I'm not saying that they're going to get through that quickly, but that will be on the list and say, at this particular site, if you're going to change your discharge location, here's the pluses and the minuses, the negatives, the pros and cons of this particular site relative to, just a discharge location change. And does it require an environmental process? What does that process take? That's going to be on the list of pros and cons.
I should say, if you take federal money, you do have a NEPA requirement, but our office provides that service as part of the 1.5 years we do. It's typically not an environmental impact statement, it's more an assessment, which is smaller.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Gaddis? So when I was working at the city and we were getting funding under the transportation funding for state transportation improvement projects, the federal requirements for environmental was way higher than if we weren't. Are we going to run into that in this project?
I don't think so. I mean, you're looking at a footprint, and that's what we have to look at. Whether the cultural resources, the cultural survey, we need to make sure there's no endangered species. I think we had a cuckoo at the Moab plant that we have to deal with. We just have to go through that process. But it's not like transportation. You're
you're putting roads through large areas, having to wetlands. If there are wetlands at the site, you're talking about a relatively limited footprint, so that analysis is not quite as extensive as you'd see on conservation. But yes, if you take federal money, you do have to comply with NEPA. And that is something that we provide as part of the incentive.
For several other questions, I just want to make sure we've answered all the questions.
Yeah, do you understand what we're looking for now?
I do.
We got some good,
I think
this was a good meeting to get some direction here. So thank you for coming in and presenting this, both of you. And,
thank you.
We look forward to other things. Look for.
I don't know if we look forward to it.
You know, let's get it done.
When Councilmember Hadley said he was happy to make a tour of the wastewater treatment plant, he doesn't know what happy means.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Any other discussion we need? Not, no. Adjourned by consent.